There is something quietly magnificent about the sky at dusk, when the last threads of golden light stretch themselves thin across the horizon, and the world below grows still and patient and waiting. It is in those moments, standing at the edge of something open, whether a wide coastal plain or a sun-warmed rooftop or a field of tall grass, sighing in the last warmth of the day, that one begins to feel something ancient stirring in the chest, a longing that has lived in human beings for as long as there have been human beings to carry it, the longing to move beyond where the feet can take us, to see what lies just past the ridge, just beyond the next wave, just above the line where the earth curves away and disappears. It is a feeling as old as curiosity itself, and it has shaped everything, every sail ever stitched together, every wheel ever carved, every wing ever dreamed of in the soft privacy of a wandering mind. Tonight we find ourselves at the beginning of a long and winding story, a story that was written not in ink, but in motion, not in words, but in wind and wire, and the quiet hum of something traveling through open space. It is the story of drones. But perhaps that word does not carry enough weight? Not yet. Not until we understand what it truly means to send something out into the world without riding alongside it, to give a machine a purpose and a path, and then let it go. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a landscape when something small is moving through the sky above it. Not a bird, though at first glance it might resemble one. Not a plane, though it shares that same gift of altitude. Something else entirely, something that belongs to a new chapter of an ancient story. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide, open valley in the early part of the morning, the dew still clinging to the grass, the light just beginning to find its angles through the low-hanging mist. And somewhere above, barely visible, a small shape moves with quiet intention against the pale blue, purposeful, unhurried, following some invisible instruction written in the language of radio waves and mathematics and human ingenuity. That image, so small, so silent, so strangely beautiful, contains within it the entire arc of what we are about to explore together. Because drones did not begin in the sky, not really. They began, as so many things do, in the human imagination, in the restless, tireless human need to solve problems, to explore, to observe, to understand, and eventually to build something that could go where we could not. The word itself, drone, carries its own quiet poetry. It is borrowed from the natural world, from the low, continuous sound of a bee in flight, a sound that has no urgency to it, no sharp edges, just a steady humming presence moving through warm summer air. And there is something fitting about that, because the machines that have come to bear that name share something of that quality. They move through the world with a kind of purposeful calm, gathering information, carrying cargo, watching coastlines, mapping mountains, delivering medicine to villages hidden deep in valleys where roads have never been built. They have become, in a remarkably short span of human history, one of the most versatile and quietly revolutionary tools that civilization has ever devised. And yet the story of how we got here, how a vague and ancient dream of remote-controlled flight became one of the defining technologies of our era, is one that most people have never fully heard. It is a story full of unexpected beginnings, of inventors working in obscurity, of military engineers solving problems that had never existed before, of hobbyists in garages who stumbled upon ideas that would eventually reshape entire industries. It is a story that moves through three worlds, through the open air above us, through the earth and its roads and cities and borders, and through the deep and shifting waters of the ocean, because drones, as it turns out, do not belong only to the sky. They move beneath the surface of the sea, gathering data from coral reefs and tracking the slow drift of underwater currents. They roll across desert terrain, carrying supplies and sensors into places where a human life would be at risk. They hover over wildfire smoke, guiding the response of firefighters who can see the shape of the danger more clearly from above. The sky version is perhaps the most familiar, the quadcopter lifting silently from a field, the fixed-wing aircraft banking gently over a river delta, but the full family of these machines is far larger and stranger and more wonderful than any single image might suggest. Tonight, we will let the full picture assemble itself slowly. There is no rush, no urgency here, only the quiet unfolding of something genuinely remarkable, spread out like a map across the table of time. We will begin very close to the beginning, not at the moment when some sleek and modern drone first lifted off a runway, but much earlier than that, in an era when the word drone had not yet been invented, and the technology was so primitive that calling it a drone at all would have required a generous imagination. We will move through the decades carefully, like someone walking a long and winding path through unfamiliar landscape, pausing now and then to take in the view, to notice some detail in the middle distance that catches the light in an interesting way. We will pass through the early experiments of the 1920s and 30s, through the extraordinary demands of the Second World War, which pushed human ingenuity to places it had never gone before, through the Cold War years when unmanned aircraft became tools of surveillance, drifting silently over borders that no human pilot could have safely crossed. And then we will arrive in our own time at the extraordinary proliferation of these machines into agriculture, into filmmaking, into package delivery, into search and rescue operations, into the mapping of ancient ruins, into the monitoring of endangered whale populations from a respectful and non-disruptive altitude. All of that is coming, but for now, there is only this, a quiet evening settling over an open landscape, a faint hum somewhere in the middle distance, and the beginning of a long, slow, richly textured story about what it means to send something out into the world and ask it to see for us, to go where we cannot go and return with something we did not know before. The story, like all true stories, begins not with a single invention, but with a question. A question so simple that it seems almost naive in retrospect, and yet so profound that it would take more than a century of human effort to fully answer it. The question was this: what if something could fly, could move through the world without anyone aboard it? That question did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, in fragments, carried by different minds in different places across different decades. It arrived in the notes of engineers who had never met each other, in the sketches of inventors who would never see the full fruit of their thinking, in the dreams of military commanders who understood instinctively that there was something deeply valuable about a vehicle that could be risked without risking a human life. The earliest ancestors of the modern drone were not sleek or sophisticated. They were in many ways barely controlled at all. And yet, within them lived the seed of everything that was to come. To find the true beginning, we must travel back to the 19th century, not to a laboratory and not to an airfield, but to a battlefield. It was the summer of 1849, and the Austrian military was facing a problem. The city of Venice, then under Austrian control, was in a state of open rebellion. The Venetian people had declared independence and were defending their city fiercely, and the Austrian forces found themselves unable to advance across the lagoon in the traditional way. So an Austrian officer named Franz von Eucatius proposed something that had never been tried before in the history of warfare. He proposed sending the attack from the sky, not with a manned aircraft. Those did not yet exist, but with balloons, small unmanned hot air balloons, each one carrying a timed explosive, drifting on the wind toward the city of Venice below. The plan was audacious, and it was imperfect. The wind did not cooperate, and most of the balloons drifted off course, and the results were militarily inconsequential. But something had happened that day that could not be undone. For the first time in recorded history, an unmanned aerial vehicle had been used in an act of war. The idea had been born, fragile and fumbling, yes, but born. And once an idea is born, it has a way of persisting. The decades that followed saw a gradual accumulation of the enabling technologies, the internal combustion engine, which made powered flight possible at all, the telegraph and early radio systems, which made the transmission of commands across distance conceivable, and the emergence of aviation itself, which gave human beings their first sustained experience of moving through the air. It was in the early years of the 20th century, in the intoxicating aftermath of the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903, that the dream of unmanned aircraft began to feel genuinely achievable, not merely a fantasy or a military curiosity, but a real and reachable possibility. The First World War provided the pressure that dreams often need to become reality. By 1916 and 17, the conflict had ground itself into a terrible stalemate, and military planners on all sides were desperately searching for new approaches, new technologies, anything that might offer an advantage without the catastrophic cost in human lives that the trenches were demanding. It was in this atmosphere of urgency that two parallel projects emerged, one in Britain and one in the United States, each attempting to build what they called an aerial torpedo, an unmanned, remotely guided aircraft that could carry an explosive payload to its target. In Britain, an engineer named Archibald Lowe led a team working on what they called the AT, short for aerial target. The idea was deceptively simple: build a small radio-controlled aircraft that could be directed toward enemy observation, balloons, which were a significant tactical problem at the time. The AT flew briefly and imperfectly in 1917. It was the first aircraft ever guided by radio control in flight, and while it never achieved military success, it demonstrated something crucial: that radio signals could be used to steer a machine through the air from the ground. Lowe, who was described by his contemporaries as having a mind that moved faster than most people could follow, would later reflect that the achievement was modest in its practical impact, but immense in its conceptual significance. He was right on both counts. Across the Atlantic, a parallel effort was underway, this one guided by two of the most remarkable minds of the early aviation era, Charles Kettering and Elmer Sperry. Kettering was an inventor of extraordinary range and productivity, a man who seemed constitutionally incapable of looking at a problem without immediately beginning to redesign it. Sperry was a pioneer of gyroscopic stabilization, the technology that allows an aircraft to maintain its orientation in flight without constant human correction. Together, and with support from the United States Army, they developed what became known as the Kettering Bug. The Bug was a small biplane-style aircraft made largely of papier-mâché and thin wood. It weighed approximately 180 pounds fully loaded, and it was designed to fly a preset distance before its engine cut out and it plunged warhead first toward its target. It was not a drone in the modern sense. It had no real-time remote guidance, but it was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time. It used a gyroscope to maintain level flight, a pneumatic system to control its wings, and a simple mechanical counter that measured propeller rotations to determine when the engine should cut. The Bug was tested extensively in 1918, achieving results that astonished the Army observers who watched from the ground. In its best trials, it struck within a very short distance of its intended target, and the Army ordered thousands of them. But the war ended before the Bugs could be deployed. The armistice of November 1918 arrived, and the most ambitious unmanned weapon of the early aviation era was quietly retired to storage and then to history. Still, the concepts it embodied did not disappear. They waited, patient as seeds in winter soil, for the conditions that would allow them to grow. Those conditions arrived in the 1930s, and they arrived, perhaps fittingly, in the form of a radio-controlled target aircraft developed not for attack but for practice. The British Royal Navy needed a way to train its anti-aircraft gunners. Live fire practice required a target that could fly, and it was both expensive and obviously impossible to use manned aircraft for this purpose. So they commissioned the development of a remotely piloted plane that could be flown from the ground and used as a moving target for the gun crews. The result was a small, elegant biplane called the de Havilland Queen Bee, and it is from this aircraft and the word queen, and perhaps from the gentle, persistent hum of something moving through warm air, that the term drone is widely believed to have entered the vocabulary of aviation. The Queen Bee first flew in 1935, and it was by any measure a success. It was reliable, it was reusable, it could be landed safely after each training session, and it proved that unmanned aircraft could be operated with a degree of control and consistency that earlier experiments had only suggested was possible. The Americans took notice. The United States Navy, watching British developments with considerable interest, began its own program, producing a series of radio-controlled target drones in the late 1930s under the designation radio plane. And here the story takes one of its more poignant turns, because among the workers at the radio plane factory in Van Nuys, California during the Second World War was a young woman named Norma Jean Dougherty, who assembled and inspected drone fuselages on the factory floor, who was later photographed there by a military photographer sent to document women's contributions to the war effort, and who would, within a few years, become known to the world under a different name entirely. But that is a small and luminous detail in a much larger story. The Second World War transformed the drone from a promising experiment into an urgent military priority, and it did so in ways that sent the technology branching off in multiple directions at once. The Germans, with their characteristic engineering ambition, developed the Fieseler Fee 103, better known to the world as the V-1 flying bomb, or buzz bomb, a pulse jet-powered, gyroscopically stabilized unmanned aircraft that carried a warhead of nearly 2,000 pounds and flew a preset course before its engine cut, and it descended to its target. More than 10,000 of these weapons were launched against Britain between June and October of 1944. They killed thousands of people and terrified millions more. And while they were not remotely guided, they were essentially sophisticated projectiles. They represented the largest deployment of unmanned aerial vehicles in history up to that point. The Allies responded with urgent development of their own unmanned programs. The Americans created Project Aphrodite, which attempted to convert old, worn-out bombers into flying bombs by removing their crews after takeoff. The aircraft would be loaded with explosives, the pilot and co-pilot would parachute to safety, and the plane would then be guided by radio control to its target. The results were mixed at best, and sometimes tragic. One of the pilots lost in these experiments was Joseph Kennedy, Jr., the older brother of the man who would later become the 35th President of the United States. The plane exploded prematurely during a mission over the English Channel in August of 1944. It was a reminder, a sobering, devastating reminder that these early unmanned systems were still deeply imperfect, still unreliable in ways that could cost lives even in the act of trying to save them. But imperfection has never been a reason for human beings to stop trying. If anything, it seems to have the opposite effect. And so the work continued, quietly, persistently, in the way that important work so often does, below the surface of the larger narratives, in laboratories and testing ranges and the back rooms of engineering departments that rarely made the headlines. The war ended, and the drone entered a new phase of its life, one that was quieter, more methodical, and in many ways more consequential than anything that had come before, because now the world knew that unmanned aircraft could work. The question was no longer whether they were possible, but what else they could become. The years after the Second World War settled into something that was not quite peace and not quite conflict, a long, uneasy tension between two superpowers, each watching the other across a vast ideological distance, each accumulating technologies and strategies and on intelligence in the way that anxious powers always do. It was in this atmosphere, the Cold War, with its particular combination of restraint and paranoia, that the unmanned aircraft found its true calling, not as a weapon, at least not primarily, but as an eye, because the problem that haunted military planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain was the same problem that has haunted strategists throughout all of human history. You cannot respond to what you cannot see. And seeing, in the age of nuclear weapons and vast land armies spread across hidden terrain, required going to places where no human being could safely go. The Soviet Union was a closed world. Its military installations, its missile sites, its troop movements, its industrial capacity, all of it was concealed behind borders that were not merely political, but genuinely dangerous to cross. And yet the United States needed to know what was happening inside those borders with a kind of desperate urgency that is difficult to fully appreciate from a distance of several decades. The early solution was the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, a breathtakingly elegant, high-altitude plane, fragile as a dragonfly and astonishingly capable, that could cruise at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far beyond the reach of Soviet interceptors, or so it was believed. On the first day of May 1960, a U-2 piloted by a CIA officer named Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk by a surface-to-air missile. Powers survived. The aircraft did not, and the resulting international incident sent a clear and unambiguous message. Manned reconnaissance flights over hostile territory were a provocation that the world could not indefinitely sustain. The answer, which had been quietly developing in parallel for years, was the unmanned reconnaissance drone. Ryan Aeronautical, a San Diego company that had been building target drones for the military since the 1940s, was asked to develop a jet-powered, remotely controlled aircraft that could perform the same reconnaissance missions as the U-2, but without a pilot aboard to be captured, interrogated, or lost. The result was the Ryan Firebee, a sleek jet-powered drone that had originally been designed as a target aircraft, but was now adapted for something far more ambitious. It carried cameras instead of warheads. It flew pre-programmed routes over denied territory, and when its mission was complete, it would descend by parachute and be retrieved by a helicopter waiting below. The visual of that retrieval, a helicopter reaching out to catch a descending drone against a blue sky somewhere over the Pacific, is one of those images that captures something essential about the era. There was a kind of improvised elegance to it, a jury-rigged ingenuity that characterized so much of the early drone program. The Firebee and its successors flew hundreds of reconnaissance missions over China, North Vietnam, and North Korea throughout the 1960s and into the 70s. They photographed airfields and missile installations and troop concentrations. They gathered signals, intelligence, monitoring radio transmissions and radar emissions. They came home with rolls of film that analysts would spend weeks examining, frame by frame, in the quiet rooms of intelligence agencies, and almost no one outside those agencies knew they existed. The drone program of the Cold War was among the most secret endeavors in American military history. The aircraft had no names in public, only designations. They flew without acknowledgement, without press coverage, without the kind of official recognition that might have compromised the missions they were flying. There is something quietly extraordinary about that secrecy. Hundreds of unmanned aircraft flying thousands of missions over some of the most dangerous airspace in the world, and the world did not know. It was in this silence that the modern drone was truly formed, not in the headlines, but in the careful, methodical accumulation of operational experience, in the lessons learned from missions that went wrong and missions that went right, in the slow refinement of guidance systems and camera systems and recovery systems that made each successive generation of aircraft more capable than the last. Meanwhile, in a parallel universe of sorts, a quieter and more democratic revolution was beginning to stir. The hobby of radio-controlled aircraft had been growing steadily since the 1930s, when enthusiasts had begun building small, lightweight planes guided by rudimentary radio systems. By the 1950s and 60s, it had become a genuine subculture, a community of tinkerers and model makers who gathered at airfields on weekends, launching their small creations into the sky with a kind of unhurried joy that stood in complete contrast to the urgent military programs unfolding simultaneously in classified facilities across the country. These hobbyists were, in a very real sense, the other branch of the drone's family tree. They were developing skills, refining techniques, and accumulating knowledge about the behavior of small unmanned aircraft that would eventually feed back into the professional world in ways that nobody at the time could have anticipated. The miniaturization of electronics, which accelerated dramatically through the 1970s and 80s, was the great enabling force of this period. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes, integrated circuits replaced transistors, and with each reduction in size came a corresponding increase in what was possible. A radio control system that had once required a bulky transmitter and a relatively heavy receiver could now be built into something small enough to fit inside a model aircraft the size of a dining room table, and then smaller still, and then smaller again. The implications of this miniaturization were not immediately obvious, even to the people living through it. Revolutions rarely announce themselves clearly until they are already well underway. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, and one of the first places it became visible was, once again, on a battlefield. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 provided a startling demonstration of what modern surface-to-air missiles could do to conventional aircraft. Egypt and Syria had deployed Soviet-supplied missile systems with devastating effect, destroying dozens of Israeli aircraft in the opening days of the conflict and demonstrating that the manned fighter jet, the symbol of air power since the Second World War, had become extraordinarily vulnerable in the face of modern ground-based defenses. Israel, with its particular combination of military urgency and technological creativity, drew a conclusion that was both logical and radical. If manned aircraft were too vulnerable, and if the missions they were flying could be accomplished by unmanned aircraft instead, then the unmanned aircraft was not merely a supplement to air power, it was, potentially, the future of it. The Israeli military began investing heavily in drone development in the years that followed, and the results of that investment would reshape the entire field. The Mastiff, developed by an Israeli company called Tadiran in the late 1970s, was something genuinely new in the world of military drones. It was not a jet-powered reconnaissance platform like the Firebee. It was smaller, slower, and far more controllable. It carried a television camera that transmitted live video back to operators on the ground in real time. That last detail, real time, is worth pausing over because all of the drone technology that had come before, however impressive, had suffered from a fundamental limitation. The information it gathered was delayed. The Firebee brought home rolls of film that had to be developed and analyzed. Its cameras could not tell the people who launched it what was happening right now. The Mastiff changed that. For the first time, a small unmanned aircraft could circle above a target and transmit a continuous live picture of what it was seeing to operators who could then act on that information immediately. This was not merely a technical improvement. It was a conceptual transformation. It changed what a drone could be used for, and it changed who could use it, and it changed the relationship between the unmanned aircraft and the human beings guiding it. The drone was no longer just a flying camera. It was becoming something closer to a flying eye, an extension of human perception into spaces and altitudes that human bodies could not safely occupy. Israel deployed these new surveillance drones during the 1982 war in Lebanon, and the results were extraordinary. The live video feeds allowed commanders to observe Syrian air defense positions with a precision and accuracy of information that had never before been possible. The intelligence gathered contributed directly to one of the most successful air campaigns in the history of modern warfare. The American military was watching and taking very careful notes. Throughout the 1980s, the Pentagon began investing in its own new generation of unmanned systems, not the massive jet-powered platforms of the Cold War reconnaissance programs, but something more like the Israeli model, smaller, more flexible, more capable of operating in close coordination with ground forces. One of the programs that emerged from this period was a small surveillance drone called the Pioneer, developed jointly by an American company and the Israeli company that had built the Mastiff. The Pioneer entered service with the United States military in 1986, and it would see action in the Persian Gulf War of 1991, becoming, in the process, one of the most famous drones in history for a reason that nobody had anticipated. During the fighting in southern Iraq, a group of Iraqi soldiers, exhausted, starving, and utterly demoralized by days of relentless bombardment, spotted a Pioneer circling overhead and chose to surrender. Not to the troops on the ground, who were not yet present, but to the drone itself. They waved white flags at the camera above them, and the images were transmitted back in real time to the astonished operators watching on their screens. It was, by any measure, the strangest surrender in the history of warfare, and it illustrated with a kind of quiet eloquence just how thoroughly these machines had become a presence in the human experience of conflict. But the story of drones was already extending well beyond the battlefield, even if that was not yet fully visible to the wider world. In the same years that military engineers were refining their unmanned reconnaissance platforms, researchers in universities and private laboratories were beginning to explore the application of similar technologies to entirely different problems. Agriculture was one of the first civilian fields to recognize the potential. Farmers had long understood the value of aerial observation, the ability to see a whole field from above, to identify areas of disease or drought stress or pest damage before they spread. But the cost of manned aircraft had always made routine aerial surveys impractical for anyone but the largest operations. A small, relatively inexpensive unmanned aircraft that could survey a field and transmit images back to a farmer's receiver on the ground. This was a different proposition entirely. The Japanese company Yamaha developed an unmanned helicopter called the R-50 in the late 1980s, originally designed for agricultural spraying. It was large by hobby standards, but small by any professional aviation standard, and it could carry a tank of pesticide or fertilizer and apply it to a field with a precision that a manned crop duster could never match. By the early 1990s, Yamaha's unmanned agricultural helicopters were operating across rice fields in Japan, quietly doing work that had previously required either a manned aircraft or hours of manual labor. It was, in its way, as significant a development as anything happening in the military programs, because it pointed towards something that the engineers in the classified facilities could not have fully imagined. A future in which unmanned aircraft were not exotic tools of national power, but practical, affordable instruments of everyday life. That future was still some years away, but it was coming. Slowly at first, and then with a speed that would surprise almost everyone. The 1990s arrived with a particular kind of momentum, a sense that the world was reorganizing itself around new possibilities, that technologies which had been developing quietly in the background were suddenly ready to step forward into the light. The personal computer had already transformed the way human beings processed and shared information. The internet was beginning its long, astonishing expansion into everyday life, and the miniaturization of electronics, which had been proceeding steadily for decades, was now accelerating in ways that even the most optimistic engineers had not fully predicted. These forces did not act on drone technology from the outside. They flowed directly into it, reshaping it from within. The Global Positioning System, GPS, became fully operational for civilian use in 1993, and its effect on unmanned aircraft was immediate and profound. Before GPS, guiding a drone along a precise path required either a human operator watching it constantly through a radio control link, or a very sophisticated and expensive inertial navigation system of the kind that only large military programs could afford. After GPS, a small unmanned aircraft could know exactly where it was on the surface of the Earth at any moment, to within a few meters, using signals from a constellation of satellites orbiting quietly far above. It could follow a programmed route with a reliability and precision that no human hand on a joystick could consistently match. The implications of this were vast and still unfolding, but they began to become visible in the late 1990s when a new generation of military drone programs started to produce results that would permanently change the nature of air power. The aircraft that did more than any other to bring the military drone into public consciousness was a slim, delicate-looking machine called the Predator. The Predator was developed by a California company called General Atomics, and it first flew in 1994. It was not fast, and it was not stealthy, and it was not particularly impressive to look at. It had a distinctive bulbous nose and a pusher propeller mounted at the rear, giving it an appearance that one observer described as looking like an upside-down bathtub with wings. But it could fly for more than 24 hours without landing. It could transmit high-definition video from cameras mounted in a stabilized turret beneath its nose. And it could do all of this while being operated by a crew sitting in a ground control station thousands of miles away, watching their screens with the focused, quiet attention of people who understood that what they were seeing was genuinely real. The Predator was deployed to Bosnia in 1995, where it flew surveillance missions over a conflict that had defied international efforts to resolve it for years. The live video it provided of troop movements, of refugee columns, of the physical evidence of atrocities, gave military and political decision-makers a kind of situational awareness that had never before been possible. And then came a modification that changed everything. In the early 2000s, engineers fitted the Predator with Hellfire missiles, and in doing so, they transformed it from a surveillance platform into something that had no precedent in the history of warfare. An unmanned aircraft that could not only watch a target, but destroy it, guided by an operator sitting in a temperature-controlled building in the Nevada desert. The ethical, legal, and strategic questions raised by this capability were profound and are still being debated. But whatever one's position on those questions, the technical reality was undeniable. The armed drone had arrived, and it would permanently alter the calculus of military operations. The Predator and its larger successor, the Reaper, flew thousands of missions over Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, and Somalia in the years that followed. They became, for many people around the world, the defining image of American military power in the early 21st century. Silent shapes circling high above, visible only as a faint hum if the wind was right and the sky was quiet. But even as the military drone was commanding headlines and reshaping geopolitics, something equally significant and far more gentle was happening in garages and workshops and university engineering departments across the world. The commercial drone was being born. The technologies that made it possible had been converging for years. Small, powerful electric motors had become dramatically cheaper and more efficient. Lithium polymer batteries had transformed the energy storage available to small aircraft. Microelectronics had reached the point where a fully capable autopilot system could be built onto a circuit board smaller than a playing card. And crucially, the open-source software movement had made sophisticated flight control algorithms available to anyone with the curiosity to use them. In the mid-2000s, a community of engineers and enthusiasts began building what they called multi-rotor aircraft, drones with not one or two propellers, but 4 or 6 or 8, arranged in a flat configuration that gave them extraordinary stability and maneuverability. These were the quadcopters, the hexacopters, the octocopters, that would eventually become the most recognizable shape in the civilian drone world. The key insight that made multi-rotor drones practical was that their stability could be managed entirely by software. A single-rotor helicopter is notoriously difficult to fly because the pilot must constantly make tiny, precise adjustments to the controls. A quadcopter, by contrast, uses a flight controller, a small computer running algorithms many thousands of times per second, to continuously adjust the speed of each of its 4 motors, making the corrections that keep it level and stable automatically without any input from the human operator. This meant that a quadcopter could be flown by someone with no aviation experience whatsoever. You simply pushed a stick and it moved. You let go of the stick and it stopped, hovering in place with a steadiness that would have seemed magical to the radio control hobbyists of the 1960s. The company that more than any other brought this technology to the mass market was a Chinese firm called DJI, Dajiang Innovations, founded in Shenzhen by a young engineer named Frank Wang, who had been obsessed with radio-controlled aircraft since childhood. DJI's first consumer drone, the Phantom, was released in 2013, and it was a revelation. It was white, compact, and remarkably simple to operate. It could take off with a single command, hold its position in the air with GPS-assisted stability, and return to its launch point automatically if the control link was lost. And it carried a camera that could capture high-definition video of extraordinary quality. The Phantom and the products that followed it opened the sky to people who had never imagined they might have access to it. Filmmakers who could now achieve aerial shots that had previously required a helicopter and a substantial budget. Farmers who could survey their fields in minutes rather than days. Real estate agents who could show a property from angles that no ground-level photograph could capture. The world, seen from above, looked different, more interconnected, more beautiful, more comprehensible in some ways, and more mysterious in others. And the drone was the instrument that made this new perspective available. But the sky was not the only domain where unmanned systems were undergoing this transformation. Far below the surface of the world's oceans, a parallel revolution was unfolding with rather less fanfare, but no less significance. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and yet it remains, in many respects, the least known environment on the planet. The pressures at depth, the darkness, the cold, the sheer logistical difficulty of operating in a marine environment, all of these factors had made ocean exploration one of the most challenging and expensive endeavors in all of science. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, had been developed for underwater use since the 1960s. They were tethered to surface ships by long cables that carried power down and data back up, and they were operated by pilots watching video feeds from cameras mounted on the vehicle's hull. They were large, expensive, and required specialized ships and crews to operate. But the same miniaturization and software revolution that had transformed aerial drones was now beginning to transform underwater unmanned systems as well. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, emerged in the 1990s and 2000s as a genuinely new category of ocean technology. Unlike ROVs, they carried their own power sources and operated entirely without tethers, following pre-programmed routes through the water and collecting data with sensors that measured temperature, salinity, current speed, water chemistry, and a dozen other variables simultaneously. They descended into ocean trenches where no human being had ever been. They mapped the seafloor with sonar systems that built three-dimensional pictures of the underwater landscape in extraordinary detail. They tracked whale populations by recording the acoustic signatures of animals moving through the deep water hundreds of miles away. One of the most evocative applications of underwater drone technology was the exploration of historical shipwrecks. An AUV or ROV could be sent down to a wreck lying in water too deep for human divers, and it could circle the hull with its cameras running, collecting footage and measurements that archaeologists could then study at the surface. The wreck of the Titanic, lying more than 2 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, was explored in this way. Unmanned vehicles descending through miles of cold, dark water to document a ship that had last been seen by human eyes in April of 1912. There is something deeply moving about that image, a small machine, lit by its own lights, moving slowly through the darkness of the deep ocean, recording the resting place of something that had carried human lives and human stories. It is a kind of witness that human beings could not themselves provide, and it was made possible only because the technology had advanced to the point where such a machine could be trusted to go and return safely. And then there was the land. Ground-based unmanned vehicles had their own history, running parallel to the aerial and underwater programs and sharing many of the same technological DNA. The earliest ground robots were developed in the 1960s and 70s, initially as tools for handling radioactive materials in nuclear facilities. They were large, slow, tethered to operators by long cables, and capable of only the most basic manipulations, but they established the principle that a machine could be directed to do physical work in an environment that was too dangerous for a human body to enter. Military interest in ground robots intensified significantly after the bombing attacks on American forces in Lebanon in 1983 and again in the years following the first Gulf War, when the threat posed by improvised explosive devices became one of the defining tactical challenges of modern conflict. The bomb disposal robot, squat, tracked, carrying a camera and a manipulator arm, became a familiar presence in conflict zones from the Balkans to Iraq to Afghanistan. It was sent down roads and into buildings and around suspicious objects that might have been bombs, doing work that would otherwise have required a human being to walk towards something that might kill them. These machines saved lives in a way that was quiet and unglamorous and deeply important. They did not make headlines in the way that armed predator drones did, but the soldiers who worked alongside them understood their value in a way that no statistics could fully convey. As the 2000s progressed and the technology continued to mature, the applications of ground-based unmanned systems expanded far beyond the military sphere. Warehouse logistics companies began deploying autonomous mobile robots that could navigate complex indoor environments, retrieving items from shelves and delivering them to packing stations with an efficiency that transformed the economics of large-scale distribution. Agriculture, again, was an early adopter. Autonomous tractors guided by GPS and sensors could plow, plant, and harvest with a precision that human-operated equipment could not match, and they could do so around the clock, working through the night hours when a human driver would need to stop and rest. And slowly the idea of the autonomous car, a ground vehicle that could navigate public roads without a human driver, moved from science fiction into the realm of serious engineering. The DARPA Grand Challenge of 2004, in which teams from universities and technology companies competed to build a vehicle that could navigate a desert course autonomously, produced results that were initially disappointing. The winning vehicle traveled only 7.5 miles of the required 150 before stopping, but the following year, 5 vehicles completed the full course. And the year after that, teams were navigating complex urban environments, obeying traffic laws, and responding to other vehicles in competitions that would have seemed impossible just a decade before. The unmanned vehicle, in all its forms and environments, was no longer the province of secret military programs and specialized research institutions. It was becoming something woven into the fabric of ordinary life, quietly and persistently, in the way that truly transformative technologies always do. And as that transformation continued, as the drones multiplied and diversified and found their way into more and more corners of human activity, there was a growing sense that something larger was at work, something that went beyond the specifics of any individual technology or application. A sense that the relationship between human beings and the machines they build was shifting in some fundamental way, that the long story of human tool making had reached a new chapter, one in which the tools were becoming, in some meaningful sense, independent, capable of going where we could not go, seeing what we could not see, doing what we could not safely do. And that realization, quiet as it was, gradual as it had been in its arrival, carried with it a weight that was worth sitting with for a moment, worth contemplating in the unhurried way that important things deserve. There is a question that lives quietly at the center of all of this. Not a technical question, not an engineering problem to be solved, but something older and more persistent than either of those things. It is the question of what it means to extend ourselves. Human beings have always been makers of extensions. The hammer is an extension of the fist. The wheel is an extension of the foot. The telescope is an extension of the eye. Each tool we have ever built has been, in some fundamental sense, an attempt to reach further than our bodies alone would allow. But the drone is something different from a hammer or a wheel or even a telescope, because it does not merely amplify what we can do in the place where we are standing. It goes somewhere else entirely. It occupies a space that we ourselves do not occupy, and it acts there, and it perceives there, and it returns or transmits what it has found. It is, in a very real sense, a proxy for human presence, a way of being somewhere without being there. And that distinction, subtle as it might seem, carries implications that ripple outward in every direction. When an unmanned aircraft surveys a wildfire from above, mapping the leading edge of the flames in real time and transmitting that map to the incident commanders below, it is doing something that no human being could safely do. The drone is not replacing a firefighter. It is going where no firefighter could go, and the information it brings back saves lives in ways that are measurable and direct and deeply consequential. When an underwater drone descends into the crushing darkness of a deep ocean trench and returns with images of creatures that have never been seen by human eyes before, it is extending the reach of human curiosity into a place that human bodies cannot survive. It is, in the most literal sense, seeing for us. When an autonomous ground vehicle navigates a road littered with improvised explosives, moving carefully toward an object that might detonate at any moment, it is accepting a risk on behalf of a human being who would otherwise have had to accept that risk themselves. It is standing in the most courageous possible interpretation of that phrase, for a person who has a family and a future and a life worth protecting. These are not small things. They are among the most important things that any technology has ever done. And yet there is a shadow alongside each of these bright examples, a complexity that honest reflection cannot ignore. The same capability that allows a drone to map a wildfire can be used to surveil a neighborhood without the knowledge or consent of the people who live there. The same precision that makes an armed drone effective in a conflict zone raises questions about accountability and proportionality and the moral weight of decisions made from thousands of miles away, in rooms where the consequences are visible only on screens. The same autonomous systems that navigate warehouses with elegant efficiency are reshaping labor markets in ways that are still incompletely understood. The same technology that promises to deliver medicine to remote communities also raises questions about airspace management and privacy, and the accumulation of data about human movement and behavior. These tensions are not reasons to turn away from the technology. They are reasons to engage with it more carefully, more thoughtfully, more honestly. They are the questions that a society must ask itself when it stands at the edge of a genuinely new capability and chooses how to use it. And there is something quietly hopeful in the fact that these questions are being asked, that researchers and ethicists and policymakers and ordinary citizens are grappling with them, not always with clear answers, but with a seriousness of purpose that suggests an awareness of what is at stake. Because the history of drone technology is, at its deepest level, a history of human choices made by engineers about what to build, by military commanders about how to use it, by politicians about what to permit, by companies about what to sell, by farmers and filmmakers and oceanographers and conservationists about what problems to solve. Each of those choices has shaped the technology, and the technology has shaped the world. and the world has shaped the choices that came next. It is a loop, continuous and alive, the way all important human stories are. What is perhaps most remarkable, when one steps back far enough to see the whole arc of it, is how recently this story began in its modern form, and how much has already happened. In less than 100 years, barely 2 or 3 human lifetimes, the drone has traveled from Franz von Uchatius, releasing explosive balloons over Venice, to autonomous underwater vehicles mapping the floor of the Mariana Trench, from the papier-mâché Kettering bug to a fleet of commercial quadcopters delivering packages in suburban neighborhoods, from the secret Cold War reconnaissance flights of the Firebee to a high school student assembling a capable drone from a kit ordered online and flying it over a wheat field to help a family farm make better decisions about irrigation. That is an extraordinary distance to have traveled in so short a time. And the journey is far from over. The next chapters are already being written in laboratories and design studios and venture-funded startups and government research programs. Urban air mobility, which envisions networks of small autonomous aircraft carrying passengers through city airspace the way taxis move through city streets. Swarm technology, which allows hundreds or thousands of small drones to coordinate their behavior like a flock of birds, each one simple, the collective intelligent, fully autonomous, underwater gliders that can spend months at sea, drifting through ocean currents and collecting data with a patience and persistence that no crewed vessel could match. These futures are not certainties. They are possibilities being shaped right now by the same combination of human ingenuity and human choice that has shaped everything that came before. And in that shaping, there is something that feels, if one sits with it long enough, genuinely wondrous. The closing light of the day moves slowly across an open field, and somewhere in the middle distance, barely visible against the deepening blue of the evening sky, a small shape moves with quiet purpose. It banks gently, following some invisible instruction written in the language of satellites and algorithms, and the accumulated ingenuity of 100 years of human effort. And then it turns, and the light catches it for just a moment, a brief silver flash against the darkening air, and then it is gone. What it saw up there we cannot know from where we stand. Perhaps a river winding through the landscape below, catching the last light on its surface. Perhaps the edge of a forest, its canopy thick and dark, and full of the particular silence that forests hold after the birds have quieted for the evening. Perhaps nothing more than open sky, and the gradual appearance of the first stars, and the long, slow darkening of the world below. It does not matter, not really. What matters is that it went, and that it carried with it something of the oldest human longing, the one that has always lived in the chest when we stand at the edge of something open and wide. The longing to know what lies beyond the next horizon. There is a river somewhere in the world tonight that an underwater drone is tracing silently through the dark water, its sensors reading the temperature and chemistry of the current, building a picture of an ecosystem that scientists will study for years to come. There is a desert somewhere that a ground rover is crossing with patient, measured steps, gathering soil samples from a landscape that no human foot has touched. There is a coastline somewhere where a small fixed-wing aircraft is circling in the dark, monitoring the movement of sea turtles coming ashore to nest. its cameras recording a moment of ancient biological rhythm that has been repeating itself on these beaches for longer than human beings have been keeping records. All of this is happening right now in the quiet hours, in the spaces between the places where human attention is gathered, in the margins of the map where the interesting things have always lived. The world is full of these quiet missions, these small, purposeful journeys into the places that, like curiosity, has always wanted to reach, and the machines that make them possible are themselves the product of a very long journey, one that began with a question and a dream, and a balloon drifting uncertainly over a lagoon in the summer of 1849. The grass in the field stirs a little, responding to some gentle movement of the air. The stars are clearer now, each one sharp and steady in the darkening sky, and the hum, if there was ever a hum at all, has faded into the general quiet of the evening. The story does not end, not really. It simply continues in the dark, in the water, in the air above the sleeping fields, carried forward by the same restless, beautiful human need that started it all, the need to see further, to go further, to understand a little more of this wide and endlessly interesting world. And somewhere up there, moving through the dark with quiet purpose, something is doing exactly that. I imagine a place where silence lives, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of deep attention, the kind that gathers when countless minds have passed through the same threshold, seeking something they cannot always name. There is a particular quality to the air in certain rooms, a stillness that feels almost intentional, as though the space itself has learned to hold its breath. And in that holding, in that patient suspension, something extraordinary occurs. Knowledge becomes tangible. Ideas take on weight and texture, and time moves differently than it does in the world outside. I think of buildings constructed for a singular purpose, structures designed not for commerce or industry or spectacle, but for the patient accumulation of human understanding, places where the architecture itself whispers of continuity, where stone and wood and careful craftsmanship create chambers meant to outlast the lives of those who built them, meant to serve generations not yet born. The concept is ancient, older than empires, older than the written systems that would eventually fill these spaces. The simple recognition that what we learn, what we discover, what we create with our minds deserves to be gathered, protected, offered to those who come after. Before there were buildings, there were keepers, individuals entrusted with the responsibility of remembering, of preserving the stories and formulas and observations that form the foundation of understanding. These were living libraries, human vessels of accumulated wisdom, and the communities that relied upon them understood implicitly the fragility of knowledge passed only through voice and memory. But something shifts when knowledge finds a more permanent home, when it moves from the ephemeral territory of human recall into physical form. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, papyrus scrolls wrapped carefully against the deterioration of time, parchment pages bound between protective covers. Suddenly, the scope of what can be preserved expands exponentially. And with that expansion comes the need for spaces designed specifically to house these growing collections. I picture the earliest of these places, rooms in palaces and temples where scrolls were stored in neat rows, where scholars could consult records of harvests and astronomical observations, tax collections, and royal decrees. These were not public spaces, not open to wandering curiosity, but restricted archives serving the administrative and religious functions of early civilizations. Yet even in their exclusivity, they represented something remarkable, the understanding that written knowledge required dedicated space, plus careful organization, intentional preservation. The Mesopotamians kept such collections, meticulously cataloged tablets recording everything from mathematical calculations to epic poetry. The Egyptians maintained houses of papyrus, extensive holdings of religious texts and practical manuals, and in doing so, they established patterns that would echo through millennia. The recognition that knowledge scattered and disorganized becomes knowledge lost, that collection requires curation, that preservation demands more than simply accumulating material. It requires systems, attention, devotion to the task of making information accessible. And there is something profoundly human in this impulse, this drive to gather what we have learned and make it available to others, to create institutional memory that transcends individual lifetimes. It speaks to an optimism about the future, a belief that there will be people who want to know, who need to know, who will benefit from access to the accumulated understanding of those who came before. I think about the first person to organize a collection, to decide that scrolls should be arranged by subject or author, to create some system by which a specific text could be located among hundreds or thousands. The care required for such work, the recognition that a collection without order becomes a labyrinth, beautiful perhaps in its abundance, but frustrating in its impenetrability. The ancient world saw these institutions grow in ambition and scale, moving beyond purely administrative functions towards something more expansive, the recognition that knowledge itself, divorced from immediate practical application, held value, that poetry and philosophy and history deserve preservation alongside accounting records and legal codes, that human culture produced wisdom worth maintaining even when it served no obvious utilitarian purpose, and so the buildings grew larger, the collections more diverse, the missions more encompassing. Rooms became wings, wings became entire complexes, and the people who tended these spaces, who cataloged and preserved and made accessible the gathered materials, became a distinct profession, guardians of something both precious and peculiar, repositories of human thought made manifest in physical form. The ancient Mediterranean world understood something profound about the relationship between power and knowledge, that empires built on military might alone would crumble, but empires that cultivated learning, that gathered the intellectual wealth of conquered peoples and made it their own, these could achieve a different kind of permanence, a legacy that outlasted stone monuments and territorial boundaries. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, in a city named for its conqueror, at the Delta, where the Nile meets the sea, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt conceived of something unprecedented in scale and ambition, an institution that would attempt to gather all the knowledge of the known world under a single roof, to create a collection so comprehensive that scholars would need to travel nowhere else. Everything worth knowing would be there, waiting. Alexandria was already a marvel. A planned city of wide streets and impressive architecture, a meeting place of cultures where Greek and Egyptian and Jewish communities mingled, where trade routes converged and ideas cross-pollinated, and into this cosmopolitan environment came the vision of the Museon, the Temple of the Muses, and its extraordinary library. The ambition was breathtaking. Messengers were sent to every corner of the known world with instructions to purchase or copy any texts they encountered. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbor were searched, not for contraband in the traditional sense, but for books. Any scrolls found would be confiscated, taken to the library where they would be meticulously copied. The copies returned to the ship owners, while the originals remained in the collection, a practice that spoke both to the value placed on authentic texts and to the ruthless determination to acquire knowledge by any means necessary. The numbers are staggering even by modern standards. Estimates suggest the library may have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height. Though precise accounting is impossible now, lost to the same forces that would eventually claim the library itself. But imagine the physical reality of such a collection. Hall after hall, lined with wooden shelves or cylindrical containers, each holding rolled papyrus marked with titles and authors, a labyrinth of human thought and observation, poetry and mathematics, astronomy and medicine, history and philosophy, drama and engineering. The scholars who worked there were not mere custodians. They were supported by royal patronage, given stipends and housing, freed from financial concerns so they might dedicate themselves entirely to study, to translation, to the advancement of understanding. It was perhaps the first true research institution, a place where inquiry itself was the primary occupation, where the production of new knowledge was valued as highly as the preservation of old. And they produced remarkable work in those halls. Euclid may have developed his geometric principles there, organizing mathematical knowledge into a systematic framework that would dominate the field for 2 millennia. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, using geometry and observations of shadows at different latitudes. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. 17 centuries before Copernicus would receive credit for the same insight, the library was not merely a repository. It was an engine of discovery. The organization of such a vast collection required innovation. The head librarians, figures like Zenodotus and Callimachus, developed systematic cataloging methods. Callimachus created the Pinaches. Effectively, the first library catalog, a 120-volume index organizing works by subject and author, providing plot summaries and biographical information, establishing standards for citation and attribution that echo through the modern scholarship. It was an extraordinary intellectual achievement in its own right. The recognition that access requires order, that a collection ungoverned by systematic organization becomes unusable regardless of its richness. But Alexandria was not alone in recognizing the value of gathered knowledge across the Mediterranean. In Pergamon, another Hellenistic kingdom was building its own great library, creating a rivalry that drove both institutions to greater heights of acquisition and scholarship. When the Ptolemies attempted to restrict the export of papyrus to handicap their competitors, Pergamon responded by developing parchment, treated animal skin that proved more durable than papyrus, a technological innovation driven by the competition for intellectual supremacy. In Rome, as the Republic gave way to empire, wealthy citizens began assembling private libraries, recognizing that a collection of Greek and Latin texts signaled cultural sophistication, intellectual seriousness, participation in the broader world of learning, and eventually, Rome would establish public libraries, institutions funded by the state and open to citizens, the first in the Western world to embrace the concept that access to knowledge should extend beyond the wealthy elite. The idea traveled, evolved, adapted to different cultures and needs. In ancient China, imperial libraries preserved classical texts and historical records, employing scholar officials to maintain and interpret the collections. Confucian emphasis on learning and the examination system created deep respect for books and the institutions that housed them, though natural disasters and political upheavals would repeatedly destroy these collections. The commitment to rebuilding them remained constant. The recognition that continuity of culture depended upon continuity of access to foundational texts. The Great Library at Alexandria met an end that remains contested and unclear. Not a single catastrophic event, but likely a gradual decline. Fires during Julius Caesar's siege, budget cuts under later Roman rule, the rise of Christianity and deliberate destruction of pagan texts. Eventually, the physical structure may have been damaged or destroyed during the Muslim conquest, though by then the collection itself had long since dispersed or deteriorated. What remains clear is the loss, the absence, the countless works that existed in single copies, plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we know existed only through references in surviving texts, scientific treatises, historical accounts, poetry, philosophy, gone. But the idea survived. The concept that knowledge could and should be gathered or organized, preserved, made accessible. It would resurface again and again throughout history, adapting to new technologies and social structures, but always maintaining that core recognition that human understanding advances through accumulation, through building upon the work of previous generations, through maintaining institutional memory that transcends individual mortality. In the Islamic world, as Europe entered its medieval period, a new golden age of learning emerged. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, became a center of translation and scholarship, where texts in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit were rendered into Arabic, where scholars from different religious and cultural backgrounds collaborated on projects of mathematical, astronomical, and medical research, where the works of Aristotle and Galen and Euclid found new life and commentary. The Abbasid caliphs who sponsored this institution understood something their European counterparts would not fully grasp for centuries, that investment in learning produced returns that military conquest alone could not, that a civilization's greatness could be measured by its intellectual achievements as much as by its territorial extent. And so they gathered scholars, provided resources, created an environment where inquiry flourished. The manuscripts produced in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning were themselves works of art. Calligraphy elevated to extraordinary levels of skill and beauty, illuminations and geometric decorations that transformed the page into visual poetry. The physical book became an object worthy of reverence, a vessel for knowledge, but also a demonstration of the civilization's aesthetic and technical achievements. These collections grew, spread across the Islamic world. In Cordoba, the Umayyad library reportedly held 400,000 volumes, a collection that rivaled ancient Alexandria. In Cairo, in Damascus, in countless other cities, institutions dedicated to learning gathered texts, supported scholars, created networks of intellectual exchange that spanned continents, and slowly, gradually, knowledge began flowing back into Europe. Through Spain, where Islamic and Christian scholars lived in proximity, through Sicily, through returning crusaders and traveling merchants, Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts, sometimes with added Arabic commentary that enriched or challenged the original arguments. The West rediscovering its own classical heritage through the patient preservation work of scholars who had maintained and built upon that heritage, while Europe struggled through political fragmentation and economic decline. The medieval European monastery played a crucial role in this preservation. In scriptoria, monk scribes spent hours each day copying manuscripts by hand, religious texts primarily, but also classical works deemed valuable or compatible with Christian teaching. It was painstaking work. A single book might take months to complete. Every letter formed carefully, illuminations added with mineral pigments and gold leaf, and each completed volume represented not just text preserved, but labor offered as devotion, the work of copying understood as a form of prayer. Monastery libraries were often small by ancient standards, perhaps a few hundred volumes, but they represented continuity. Scattered repositories that collectively preserved fragments of classical learning through centuries when centralized institutions were rare, and the monastic tradition of study, of lectio divina and scholarly commentary, kept alive the practice of careful reading, close analysis, the recognition that texts rewarded sustained attention and contemplation. Cathedral schools and early universities began emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries, creating new demand for texts, new centers where books were needed, where students and masters required access to canonical works in theology, law, medicine, philosophy, and this demand stimulated the development of commercial book production. Scriptoria, operating not as devotional practice, but as business, creating the infrastructure that would make possible an even more revolutionary transformation in how knowledge was preserved and disseminated. The invention that changed everything arrived not with fanfare, but with the practical concerns of a German goldsmith seeking a more efficient way to produce indulgences. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, developed in the 1440s, transformed the relationship between knowledge and accessibility in ways that would ripple forward through centuries. What had required months of careful hand copying could now be reproduced in days with consistency, with accuracy, and in quantities previously unimaginable. The first substantial book printed with movable type was a Bible. The pages, remarkably beautiful, designed to mimic the finest manuscript work so that early buyers might not even realize they were purchasing something mechanically produced. But the implications extended far beyond religious texts. Suddenly, the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy could be produced in editions of hundreds, distributed across Europe, standardized in a way manuscripts never were, every copy of a printed book identical to every other, creating the possibility of shared reference, of scholars in distant cities working from exactly the same text. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's innovation, printing presses operated in more than 200 European cities, producing perhaps 20 million books. The speed of adoption speaks to the hunger that existed, the pent-up demand for access to texts that had been artificially scarce. And as books became more available, as prices dropped, the audience expanded, literacy rates began rising, and with them the potential readership for new ideas, controversial ideas, ideas that challenged established authority. The library as institution had to adapt to this new abundance. Collections that had been measured in hundreds now aspired to thousands, then tens of thousands. The challenge shifted from preservation of rare texts to selection, organization, management of ever-growing holdings. And new kinds of libraries emerged to serve different purposes, different constituencies. University libraries expanded dramatically. Oxford's Bodleian Library, established in the early 17th century, implemented a radical policy. It would attempt to collect everything published, at least everything published in England, through legal deposit requirements. Publishers were obligated to provide copies of new books, ensuring comprehensive collection of the nation's printed output. The ambition was extraordinary: to create a complete record of English intellectual and literary production, generation after generation, and the reading room itself became a space designed for contemplation and study. High ceilings, tall windows admitting natural light, long tables where scholars could spread out materials, request volumes from the stacks, spend hours or days immersed in research. Silence enforced not by stern librarians, but by mutual understanding among readers that this was a place for concentration, for the deep focus required by difficult texts, for the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only through sustained engagement. In France, the Bibliothèque Mazarin opened to scholars in the 1640s, followed by the Royal Library, which would eventually become the Bibliothèque Nationale. These were not merely repositories, but statements of national ambition, assertions that a great nation required great institutions of learning, that the collection and organization of knowledge reflected the sophistication of the state itself. Private libraries flourished among the wealthy, elaborate rooms lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, purchased sometimes for their content, but often for their appearance. Books as markers of status and cultivation, yet even these collections, assembled partly for show, contributed to the broader ecosystem of preservation, and many would eventually be donated or bequeathed to institutions, becoming public resources. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, and with it a new conception of the library's social role. Knowledge was increasingly understood not as the privileged domain of clergy and aristocracy, but as a public good, essential to the functioning of civil society, to the education of citizens, to the advancement of reason and progress. And so the movement toward public libraries gained momentum. Benjamin Franklin established a subscription library in Philadelphia in 1731. Members paid fees to support the collection and in return gained borrowing privileges. It was a modest beginning, but represented a crucial shift. The idea that ordinary citizens, tradesmen and merchants, should have access to books, that reading and self-education were not frivolous luxuries but essential components of civic participation and personal advancement. In Britain, the push for true public libraries funded by taxation and free to all residents, gained strength through the 19th century. Advocates argued that providing working people with access to books would reduce social problems, encourage self-improvement, create a more informed and rational populace. The Public Libraries Act of 1850 allowed municipalities to levy taxes for library establishment, though adoption was gradual, meeting resistance from those who questioned whether public funds should support what they viewed as entertainment. But the libraries that emerged from this movement were remarkable spaces, often grand buildings designed to inspire respect for learning, entrance halls with vaulted ceilings, reading rooms with rows of wooden tables and brass lamps, children's sections bright and welcoming, reference departments staffed by librarians trained in the new science of library classification and service. These were democratic institutions in the truest sense, places where anyone could enter, request materials, spend the day reading, free from obligation to purchase or justify their presence. Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy accelerated this movement dramatically. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funded the construction of more than 1,600 libraries across the English-speaking world. The buildings followed certain principles. They should be impressive but not intimidating, clearly marked as public spaces designed to welcome rather than exclude. And Carnegie insisted that communities demonstrate commitment by providing the land and promising to fund operations. His money would build the structure, but the community had to sustain the institution. The Carnegie libraries that rose in small towns and large cities shared design elements, often classical revival architecture, broad steps leading to columned entrances, high windows, separate reading rooms for adults and children, and they became community anchors, places where immigrants learned English, where children discovered books their parents could never afford to buy, where self-taught scholars pursued education, where the democratization of knowledge became tangible reality. Classification systems evolved to manage growing collections. Melville Dewey's decimal classification, developed in 1876, provided a framework for organizing all human knowledge into 10 main classes, subdivided decimally to allow infinite specificity. A book about the French Revolution would be found at 944.04, always, in every library using the system, creating standardization that made research across institutions possible. The order was logical, learnable, a tool that transformed libraries from mysterious repositories requiring expert guides into systems that users could navigate independently. The card catalog became the primary access point, wooden cabinets with hundreds of narrow drawers, each containing alphabetically arranged cards, author cards, title cards, subject cards, all referencing the same books from different angles. The physicality of the catalog was satisfying. The weight of the wooden drawer sliding open, the feel of flipping through cards, the small triumph of finding exactly what you sought, and the serendipity of discovering something unexpected while searching. Librarians themselves professionalized, developing training programs, ethical codes, standards of practice. The stereotype of the stern shushing librarian obscured the reality of skilled information professionals who understood classification systems, reference techniques, collection development, preservation methods, who could guide researchers to obscure materials, answer complex questions, connect people with the resources they needed, The good librarian was part detective, part teacher, part guardian of access. Special collections emerged within larger libraries, rare book rooms with climate control and security measures, manuscript departments preserving letters and papers of significant figures, archives maintaining institutional records and historical documents. These spaces operated under different rules. Materials often could not be borrowed, had to be used in supervised reading rooms, handled with cotton gloves, but they ensured preservation of the unique items while still allowing scholarly access. The great national libraries expanded continuously. The British Library, the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale, collections reaching into the millions of volumes, employing hundreds of staff, occupying multiple buildings, developing specialized departments for maps, music, newspapers, photographs, every format and subject area, becoming research resources of incomparable depth, destinations for scholars from around the world, pursuing questions that required access to comprehensive holdings. The Library of Congress, established in 1800 and initially destroyed when the British burned Washington during the War of 1812, was rebuilt through the purchase of Thomas Jefferson's personal library. 6,500 volumes reflecting his wide-ranging interests in history, science, philosophy, literature, law. This foundation established the library's ambition to collect comprehensively across all subjects, and as it grew, as copyright deposit laws directed copies of every American publication to its shelves, it became one of the world's great repositories, a research library serving Congress, but also the nation, eventually humanity. Reading rooms in these grand libraries were designed to inspire. The main reading room of the Library of Congress, completed in 1897, featured a dome rising 160 feet above the floor, elaborate decorations celebrating human achievement, statues of figures representing different fields of knowledge, long mahogany desks arranged in concentric circles, each with a reading lamp. The space itself argued for the nobility of scholarship, the importance of the work being done within those walls. Branch libraries extended the reach of these institutions into neighborhoods, small buildings, or even rooms in schools and community centers. Collections selected for local needs and interests, children's programming, literacy classes, meeting spaces for community groups. These were the democratic roots of the library system, the daily proof that access to knowledge was a right, not a privilege, that every community, regardless of wealth, deserved resources for learning and growth. The 20th century brought transformations that would have seemed like fantasy to earlier generations of librarians, technologies that changed not just how libraries operated, but what they fundamentally were, what they could offer, what role they played in the landscape of human knowledge. Microfilm emerged in the 1930s as a solution to preservation challenges, newspapers deteriorating on acidic paper, rare books too fragile for regular handling, bulky runs of periodicals consuming scarce shelf space. All could be photographed onto compact reels, stored in controlled environments, made accessible without risking the originals. Researchers learned to thread film onto readers, scroll through pages projected on small screens, a different experience than holding paper, but one that democratized access to materials that might otherwise be restricted. After the Second World War, a surge in higher education enrollment, fueled by programs like the GI Bill, created unprecedented demand for academic library resources. Universities expanded their collections aggressively, hired specialized librarians, built new facilities with open stacks allowing students to browse freely. The library became the intellectual heart of campus, the place where learning happened outside the classroom, where independent research began, where students discovered pathways into their disciplines. Photocopy technology, widely adopted by the 1960s, transformed research practices. Instead of laboriously transcribing passages, scholars could reproduce pages, build personal files of materials gathered from multiple sources. The implications for copyright and publishing would take decades to fully work out, but the immediate effect was to accelerate the pace of research, to enable forms of comparative analysis that required simultaneous access to numerous texts. Interlibrary loan networks expanded dramatically, enabled by improved cataloging standards and communication technologies. A book unavailable at one institution could be requested from another, shipped, borrowed for a limited period, returned. Researchers in small colleges gained access to materials held only at major universities. Scholars anywhere could pursue questions requiring obscure sources. The collective resources of the library system became, in theory, if not always smoothly in practice, available to any serious researcher. Computerization arrived gradually, initially in back-office operations, catalog records converted to machine-readable format, circulation systems tracking loans and returns electronically, inventory management, acquisitions, all the administrative functions that kept libraries operating. The transition required enormous effort. Decades of catalog cards representing millions of items had to be converted to digital records, standardized, entered into databases, but the potential was evident. Computers could search and sort and correlate in ways impossible with physical systems. The Online Public Access Catalog, the OPAC, began replacing card catalogs in the 1980s. Terminals, where users could search the collection by author, title, subject, keyword, Boolean operators allowing complex queries, finding all books by a particular author on a specific topic published after a certain year, searches that would have required consulting multiple card drawers and cross-referencing entries, now completed in seconds, and the catalog could show not just whether the library owned an item, but whether it was currently available, where it was located, when it was due back if checked out. But something was lost in the transition. The serendipity of the card catalog, the adjacent cards noticed while searching for a specific entry, the handwritten annotations librarians sometimes added, the physical trace of use, worn cards for popular items, the sensory experience of working with a tangible system. These became nostalgia, memories of a way of doing things that seemed charmingly antiquated, even to those who had relied upon it. The Internet arrived not as library technology, but as something parallel, potentially competitive. Suddenly, information was available outside institutional frameworks. Anyone with network access could find facts, read news, communicate with others. The early utopian rhetoric suggested libraries might become obsolete. Why maintain expensive buildings and collections when everything would soon be digitized and freely available online? But librarians understood what enthusiasts sometimes missed, that information abundance creates its own challenges. that findability and reliability are not guaranteed by mere availability, that curation and organization remain essential, that not everything would be digitized, not everything should be, that physical materials and digital resources could coexist, serving different needs, different uses. The shift toward digital collections accelerated through the 1990s and into the new millennium. Academic journals moving online, databases of articles searchable from any networked computer, ebooks emerging as an alternative format, though adoption remained slower than predicted. Digitization projects like Google Books attempting to scan millions of volumes, creating searchable full-text repositories, raising complex questions about copyright and access and preservation, libraries adapted by becoming hybrid spaces, physical collections supplemented by licensed digital resources, reference librarians helping users navigate both print indices and online databases, computer terminals joining reading tables, Wi-Fi networks enabling researchers to bring their own devices. The library building transformed from being primarily a warehouse for books into a multifunctional learning and community space. Public libraries especially embraced this expanded role, offering not just books but internet access for those without home connections, digital literacy training, job search assistance, meeting rooms for community groups, programming for children and teens, maker spaces with three-dimensional printers and recording equipment, homework, help, and ESL classes. The library became a democratic technology center, an educational hub. A third place, neither home nor work, where people could gather, learn, access resources and opportunities. The physical book persisted despite predictions of its demise. Readers discovered that different formats suited different purposes. Ebooks convenient for travel. Physical books preferred for sustained reading, for books meant to be kept and reread, for the pleasure of browsing shelves. And libraries continued acquiring both, balancing user preferences with budget constraints, preservation responsibilities with demand for new materials, challenges mounted, budgets stagnating or declining even as costs increased. Journal subscriptions consuming ever larger portions of academic library budgets, forcing cancellations, limiting access, public libraries facing pressure to demonstrate value in quantifiable terms, circulation statistics and program attendance becoming measures of success in ways that perhaps missed the less tangible but equally important roles libraries played. Yet the fundamental purpose remained: connecting people with knowledge, with information, with stories and ideas, and the accumulated understanding of human culture. The formats changed, the technologies evolved, the specific services adapted to community needs, but the core mission persisted across millennia. From clay tablets in Mesopotamian palace archives to digitized manuscripts accessible from anywhere with internet connection, the library endured as an institution dedicated to preservation, organization, access, and in an age of information overload, when search engines return millions of results in milliseconds, when anyone can publish anything online without editorial oversight or fact-checking, when algorithmic recommendations create filter bubbles and echo chambers, the library's curatorial function gained new relevance. Librarians as guides through information chaos, helping users evaluate sources, distinguish reliable from unreliable, develop critical literacy skills essential for navigating the contemporary information landscape. Special collections and archives found new audiences through digitization, rare manuscripts viewable online by researchers who could never visit in person, historical photographs discoverable through keyword searches, oral history recordings preserved and made accessible. The work of digitization, labor-intensive and expensive, requiring careful handling of fragile materials, high-resolution scanning, metadata creation, but resulting in dramatic expansion of who could access these unique resources. Indigenous communities and former colonies began reclaiming knowledge, seeking return of cultural materials held in distant libraries, or at a minimum requesting consultation and shared stewardship, raising important questions about ownership, about whose stories get told and who controls access, about the colonial histories embedded in many great collections, challenging institutions to examine their practices and relationships with source communities. The library building itself remained important, not as the sole point of access, but as physical manifestation of community commitment to learning, to literacy, to democratic values. The Carnegie libraries that had served small towns for a century needed updating. Some were renovated, repurposed, a few, sadly, demolished, but many communities fought to preserve them, recognizing them as architectural landmarks and symbols of civic pride. New library buildings incorporated design elements addressing contemporary needs, flexible spaces that could be reconfigured, technology infrastructure built into the architecture, accessibility for users with disabilities, sustainable building practices, natural light and comfortable seating, cafes and group study rooms, acknowledging that learning is often social, sound-dampened quiet zones for those needing silence, attempts to create welcoming environments that serve diverse user populations and multiple purposes simultaneously. The librarian's role continued evolving, traditional skills in cataloging and reference work supplemented by expertise in digital resources, data management, information literacy instruction, community engagement, scholarly communication, the profession requiring continuous learning, adaptation to new technologies and changing user needs, while maintaining core commitments to intellectual freedom, privacy, equitable access. Principles that took on new urgency in digital contexts where surveillance and data collection were ubiquitous. And through all these changes, through format shifts and technological disruption, through budget crises and existential questions about relevance, libraries persisted, adapted, found ways to remain essential to the communities they served, because the need they addressed was fundamental, the human hunger for knowledge, for stories, for connection to ideas and to each other through the medium of a shared culture. These needs transcended any particular technology or format, any specific organizational system or service model. The question was never whether libraries would survive, but how they would evolve, what forms they would take, what services they would offer, and the answer emerged through experimentation, through listening to communities, through librarians' creativity and commitment, through recognition that the institution's strength lay not in any single function, but in its adaptability, its capacity to meet changing needs while maintaining fidelity to enduring values. The deeper pattern reveals itself slowly, like a constellation emerging as eyes adjust to darkness. Libraries have never been merely buildings filled with books. They have been theaters of transformation, spaces where individuals encounter ideas that reshape understanding, where communities maintain continuity across generations, where the possible expands beyond the boundaries of immediate experience. Consider what happens in the silence of sustained reading, the peculiar intimacy of engaging with another mind across distance, across time, the author perhaps long dead, the reader not yet born when the words were written. Yet in the act of reading, a connection forms. Thoughts conceived in one consciousness reconstitute themselves in another, not perfectly, never identically, but recognizably, meaningfully, and the library is the vessel that makes this encounter possible. The architecture of knowledge takes unexpected forms, the way subjects once considered separate reveal connections, mathematics illuminating music theory, biology informing philosophy, poetry capturing truths that elude scientific description, and the library organized by classification schemes, by subject headings and call numbers, paradoxically enables these discoveries, because proximity on shelves creates adjacencies in thought. The browser seeking one book notices another, follows an unexpected thread, emerges hours later having learned something they did not know they wanted to understand. There is democracy in alphabetical order, in systems that organize by topic rather than by the status of authors, in open stacks where anyone can wander, retrieve materials without intermediary. The physical act of pulling a book from a shelf, a small assertion of intellectual agency, the choice to engage, to pursue curiosity, to grant oneself permission to learn, and libraries multiply these moments millions of times over. Quiet affirmations that knowledge belongs to whoever seeks it. The preservation function operates on temporal scales difficult for individuals to comprehend. Librarians today making decisions about what future generations will have access to, which voices will be heard a century hence, which perspectives preserved, which allowed to fade. The responsibility is profound. The choice is consequential, and yet must be made. Budgets are finite, space limited, selection inevitable. And so the work proceeds with as much care and foresight as can be mustered, knowing that some part of the present will become invisible to the future, despite best efforts. Digital preservation presents challenges even more complex than conserving paper and ink. File formats become obsolete, software unreadable on new systems, websites disappear, entire archives evaporating when servers fail or companies cease operations. The paradox that information in the most technologically advanced formats may prove least durable over centuries, while medieval manuscripts on vellum remain readable after half a millennium. The solutions require ongoing active maintenance, migration from old formats to new, redundant storage, institutional commitment across decades, work that must continue indefinitely or risk catastrophic loss. The social space of libraries matters in ways not fully captured by circulation statistics. The student who has no quiet place to study at home, finding sanctuary in the reading room. The elderly patron who comes primarily for human contact, brief friendly exchanges with staff, the presence of others engaged in their own pursuits, the homeless individual seeking shelter and dignity in a space that offers both without demanding anything in return, the library as refuge, as third place, as location where one can simply be without commercial transaction or social obligation. Children's relationship with libraries often forms early and stays deeply rooted. The excitement of getting a first library card, name written in careful letters, the power it represents, access to thousands of books, the freedom to choose to take them home, story hours where librarians read aloud, voices animated, children sprawled on carpet, transported by narrative, summer reading programs, the joy of selecting armfuls of books, the weight of possibility, and sometimes, for some children, the library becomes the place where love of reading takes hold, where worlds beyond immediate circumstances become visible, imaginable, where futures other than predetermined paths suggest themselves. The reference interview, that conversational dance between librarian and patron, reveals human dimension of information seeking. The question asked often not quite the question meant, the skilled librarian listening beneath the words, clarifying, suggesting, understanding that information need is rarely simple retrieval, more often a complex negotiation with uncertainty, a groping toward understanding not yet fully formed. And the good librarian helps navigate that uncertainty, offers pathways, resources, next steps, without judgment, without assumption, meeting the questioner where they are. Academic libraries witness the formation of expertise. Undergraduate students learning to move beyond textbooks and lectures into primary sources, grappling with scholarly discourse, beginning to contribute their own ideas. Graduate students spending years in carrels and reading rooms, developing arguments, marshaling evidence. The dissertation that represents original contribution to knowledge often built from countless hours among the stacks. And the library holds all of this, the finished scholarship and the process, the published works and the archival materials that document how understanding advances through patient accumulation. Special collections preserve the ephemeral, letters and diaries, drafts and revisions, the working materials that show how creation actually happens, the false starts and crossed out lines, and these materials humanize the canonical, show writers and thinkers as people who struggled, who doubted, whose finished works represent choices among possibilities, and researchers in these collections often seek not just information but connection, intimacy with the creative process, insight into how ideas develop. Indigenous knowledge traditions pose important questions about library practices. Oral cultures where knowledge lives in performance and relationship, where context and ceremony matter, where some knowledge is restricted, not meant for general access, and Western library models built on principles of universal access and permanent preservation sometimes clash with these epistemologies, requiring institutions to develop new approaches, collaborative practices, recognition that stewardship takes different forms, that preservation and access must sometimes be balanced differently. The pandemic of 2020 revealed library importance through absence, buildings closed, physical materials inaccessible, and while many services moved online, digital reference and virtual programming and expanded ebook lending, something essential was lost. The place itself, the browsing, the chance encounters, the public computing, the after-school programs, the simple opportunity to be among others in a shared space dedicated to learning, and the eagerness with which communities returned when reopening became possible spoke to needs libraries meet that extend beyond information provision. Banned books and challenges to materials reveal ongoing tensions about library values, intellectual freedom, clashing with desires to protect or control what others, especially children, encounter, librarians defending principles of access, arguing that exposure to diverse perspectives strengthens rather than threatens, that individuals and families can make their own choices without imposing restrictions on others. The library as battleground for competing visions of what society should be, what knowledge should be available, who decides looking across millennia, from clay tablets to digital databases. The continuity seems more significant than the changes. Yes, technologies transform, scales shift, access expands, but the fundamental human activities remain: seeking knowledge, preserving understanding, organizing information, making it findable, connecting people with ideas. These impulses ancient as civilization itself, and likely to persist as long as humans wonder, question, desire to know. The future remains uncertain. Artificial intelligence and machine learning promising and threatening disruption, questions about library roles, when algorithms can retrieve information, when chatbots can answer questions. But the wise remember that technology has always posed such challenges, and libraries have always adapted, found new ways to remain relevant, because the core need is human, the hunger for understanding, for growth, for connection to accumulated wisdom, and these needs transcend any particular technological moment. Perhaps what libraries ultimately preserve is possibility, the possibility that anyone, regardless of background or circumstance, might encounter an idea that transforms understanding, might discover a passion, might develop expertise, might contribute to the ongoing conversation that is human culture. The library says, in its existence, in its openness, that this possibility is worth protecting, worth investing in, worth maintaining for generation after generation, a faith in human potential, in the value of learning, in the importance of memory and access, and the free circulation of ideas. And so the work continues. Librarians cataloging new acquisitions, shelvers returning books to their proper places, reference specialists answering questions, archivists processing collections, preserving fragile materials, all in service of something larger than any individual, in service of the collective project of maintaining and extending human understanding, of ensuring that what we have learned, created, discovered, is not lost, but carried forward, made available, offered to whoever comes seeking. The buildings stand, some grand, some modest, some centuries old, some newly constructed, but all serving similar purposes, providing space for quiet concentration, for research and discovery, for learning and growth. Doorways open, welcoming, public in the deepest sense, belonging to everyone, excluding no one, asking nothing but curiosity, respect, the willingness to engage, and inside the volumes wait, millions of them, billions, knowledge accumulated across millennia, stories and data, poetry and science, history and speculation, voices of the famous and forgotten, all held, all organized, all theoretically accessible to whoever takes the time to look, to search, to follow threads of interest wherever they lead. It is an extraordinary gift, this inheritance, built by countless individuals across generations who believed that knowledge mattered, that preservation served the future, that access should be protected, defended, expanded whenever possible, who did the unglamorous work, the cataloging and conservation, the reference service and collection development, because they understood themselves as links in a chain extending backward to ancient Alexandria and forward to generations unborn. The library endures, adapting, evolving, meeting new challenges, embracing new possibilities, but always maintaining fidelity to core purposes, always serving those fundamental human needs that transcend era or technology, the need to know, to remember, to learn from those who came before, to imagine what might come after, and in that endurance, in that persistence across centuries of change, there is something profoundly hopeful, a statement of faith in human curiosity, in the value of learning, in the possibility of understanding, in the importance of maintaining spaces, physical and institutional, where knowledge can be freely sought, freely shared, freely given to all who hunger for it. The silence of the reading room, the rustle of turn-in pages, the soft keyboard clicks, the whispered question at the reference desk. These sounds of minds at work, engaged, seeking, all part of a tradition older than most institutions, more enduring than empires, the human project of gathering what we know, organizing it, preserving it, offering it forward, generation to generation, an endless conversation, a collective memory, a gift renewed with each person who enters, each question asked, each discovery made, each moment of understanding achieved in the quiet sanctuary of accumulated human wisdom. There are moments in the story of this world when everything changes, when the familiar gives way to something vast and unrecognizable, and life itself must begin again from what remains. These are the boundary lines, the great erasures, the moments when the earth rewrites its own narrative in fire or ice or shadow, and what came before fades into layers of stone and memory. I find myself drawn to these threshold moments, not for their drama, but for their quiet instruction, for what they reveal about impermanence and adaptation, about the way life persists, even when the rules themselves dissolve. Extinction events. The term itself carries weight, a finality that seems absolute, and yet the story they tell is more nuanced than simple ending, more layered than mere catastrophe. They are the punctuation marks in a 4 billion-year sentence, the deep breaths between chapters, moments when the stage clears and new actors arrive, bearing traits and tools their predecessors never imagined. Tonight, I want to walk through these moments, to feel the texture of time when it buckles and shifts, to understand how absence makes space for presence, how loss becomes the condition for renewal. The earth has known at least 5 great dyings, 5 episodes so profound that the majority of species vanished within a geological heartbeat, leaving behind only traces, impressions in rock, chemical signatures in ancient seabeds, the faint echo of what once filled every niche and corner of the living world. But these 5 are merely the most dramatic, the boldest strokes. Beneath them lies a longer rhythm of smaller extinctions, background noise in the fossil record, a constant hum of species arriving and departing, testing the boundaries of possibility, succeeding for a time, then yielding to something better suited or simply luckier. To speak of extinction is to speak of normalcy, of the ordinary process by which life explores its options, discarding what no longer serves, making room for the untried experiment. And yet the great events stand apart, not just in scale, but in character, in the way they reshape not merely the cast, but the entire production, altering oceans and atmospheres, redrawing coastlines, tilting the axis of opportunity toward creatures previously marginal, previously invisible. I imagine standing at the edge of one of these transitions, watching the old world soften and blur, feeling the temperature shift, the chemistry of the air changing breath by breath, the familiar becoming strange, the abundant becoming rare. There is something almost dreamlike in the fossil evidence, the way entire dynasties simply stop appearing, their lineages terminating in a single stratum, a precise layer of sediment that marks before and after with geological clarity, and below that line, abundance, diversity beyond counting, reefs and forests and shallow seas teeming with forms that have persisted for millions of years, creatures so successful they seemed permanent fixtures of the world. Above it, silence, or near silence, a drastically simplified world, where a handful of survivors carry forward into emptiness, into landscapes stripped of their previous inhabitants, into oceans suddenly vast and quiet. The first time scientists recognized this pattern, this repeating signature of mass death, it challenged comfortable assumptions, the notion that life progressed smoothly, that evolution was a steady climb toward greater complexity and refinement. Instead, the record showed disruption, showed that the path was not linear but punctuated, that progress could be erased overnight in geological terms, that dominance offered no guarantee against oblivion. This realization reshaped how could we understand our own place in the sequence, our own chapter in the unfolding narrative, made us aware that we too are subject to the same laws. The same vulnerability to forces larger than adaptation can answer. And so tonight, I want to trace this pattern, to move through deep time with the patience it requires, to feel the weight of millions of years compressed into narrative, to understand what these events teach about fragility and resilience, about the price of complexity, the advantage of simplicity, the role of chance in determining who remains and who becomes only memory. We begin far back in an ocean world where life was still learning its earliest vocabulary, still working out the basic grammar of survival. The Ordovician seas were shallow and warm, spanning millions of square miles where now there is only land. And in those waters, life had begun to experiment with architecture, with the possibility of size and complexity. Trilobites crawled across the sandy bottoms, their segmented bodies a solution to the problem of movement, their compound eyes gathering light in waters clearer than any ocean we know today. They had persisted already for hundreds of millions of years, masters of their domain, so successful that their fossils would one day carpet entire mountainsides. But the true innovation of this time belonged to different creatures, to the graptolites drifting in colonies through the water column, to the brachiopods anchoring themselves to the seafloor, to the nautiloids, those early relatives of squid and octopus, some growing to lengths that would dwarf a human, apex predators in a world that had never known teeth or jaws. There were no fish yet, not as we would recognize them, no forests, no insects, no footprints on any shore. Life remained aquatic, committed entirely to the ocean, and the ocean committed entirely to life. The continents themselves were strangers to us, assembled in configurations that would make no sense on any modern map, Gondwana dominating the southern hemisphere, a massive supercontinent that would eventually fragment into Africa and South America and Antarctica and Australia and India, but for now holding together, drifting slowly northward. And then, around 445 million years ago, something changed. The first indication appears in the carbon isotope record, a subtle shift in the ratios preserved in limestone, suggesting that the global carbon cycle had entered a new state, that something was drawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at unprecedented rates. The cause, we now believe, was biological, an explosion of photosynthetic life, possibly driven by volcanic activity that released nutrients into the ocean, fertilizing the surface waters, triggering massive blooms of algae and bacteria, organisms that consumed carbon dioxide and released oxygen, altering the chemistry of both air and water. This sounds beneficial, and in the long term perhaps it was, but the immediate effect was catastrophic. As carbon dioxide levels plummeted, global temperatures followed, the greenhouse effect weakening, the planet's thermostat falling and falling until ice began to form at the poles, small caps at first, then spreading, thickening, glaciers grinding their way toward lower latitudes. The Ordovician world, accustomed to warmth, to stable tropical conditions even at high latitudes, suddenly found itself in the grip of an ice age, swift by geological standards, unfolding over perhaps a few 100,000 years, a blink in deep time but rapid enough to outpace adaptation for many species. Sea levels dropped as water locked itself into continental ice sheets. The shallow seas that covered so much of the earth began to drain, exposing the sea floor, stranding communities that had thrived in warm shallows, leaving them isolated in shrinking pools and remaining channels. The brachiopods, those shelled filter feeders that had colonized every available surface, found their habitats disappearing, their larvae unable to disperse across the newly exposed land barriers, populations fragmenting, genetic diversity collapsing, the graptolites drifting through the water column, sensitive to temperature and chemistry, began to vanish from the record, their delicate colonial structures preserved in black shales, their abundance dropping layer by layer until entire families simply ceased to exist. But the Ice Age was only the first pulse, the first blow in a 1-2 sequence that defines the Ordovician-Silurian extinction event. After perhaps 500,000 years of cold, the ice began to retreat, the climate swinging back toward warmth, and this reversal, this return to previous conditions, proved just as deadly as the initial cooling. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose rapidly, flooding the continental margins, drowning the coastal environments, but the water returning to the ocean was different now, oxygen depleted, stagnant, carrying with it the accumulated organic matter from the Ice Age. Decaying in vast quantities, the ocean began to stratify, warm oxygen-poor water sitting atop cooler layers with little mixing between them, and in these anoxic conditions, life struggled. Species that had survived the cold now suffocated in the warming hydrogen sulfide, produced by bacteria thriving in oxygen-free environments, began to accumulate, poisoning the water, releasing into the atmosphere a toxic miasma that would have been visible as a greenish haze. smelling of rot, rendering coastal areas uninhabitable. The fossil record shows the result with brutal clarity. Somewhere between 80 and 85% of all marine species disappeared. Entire orders of trilobites gone. Most graptolite lineages terminated. The great nautiloids reduced to a handful of survivors. It was the first of Earth's 5 great dyings, the first time the planet demonstrated its capacity for wholesale renewal through destruction, and it established a pattern that would repeat, with variations, over the hundreds of millions of years to follow. In the aftermath, the Silurian period dawned on a diminished world, the seas less crowded, ecological niches standing empty, and into this emptiness moved the survivors, those species fortunate or flexible enough to endure both cold and warmth, both isolation and inundation. The brachiopods persisted, though never again with their previous diversity. The trilobites continued, diminished but not destroyed, and new forms began to appear. Early fish with jaws, a revolutionary adaptation that would eventually lead to dominance, but for now just another experiment among many. Life, as it always does, began the slow work of recovery, filling the empty spaces, testing new strategies, building complexity from simplicity, unaware that this pattern would repeat, that extinction and recovery were not aberration but rhythm, the underlying pulse of biological time. Tens of millions of years passed, the Silurian giving way to the Devonian, and the oceans transformed once more into realms of abundance, the age of fishes beginning in earnest, armored placoderms prowling the depths, early sharks experimenting with cartilage instead of bone, and the first tetrapods, those transitional creatures, beginning their tentative explorations of the land. On shore, plants had finally made the leap from water, mosses and liverworts creeping across bare rock, followed by the first vascular plants, with their internal plumbing that could transport water upward, allowing them to grow taller, to capture more light, to begin the slow process of creating soil from stone. By the late Devonian, around 375 million years ago, forests existed, strange forests of giant ferns and primitive trees, some reaching heights of 30 feet or more, their roots breaking apart bedrock, their fallen leaves accumulating in thick mats, altering the chemistry of runoff into rivers and seas. And here again, success contained the seeds of disruption. The proliferation of land plants accelerated weathering, minerals washing from the continents into the ocean in quantities never before seen, nutrients flooding the coastal waters, triggering algal blooms of extraordinary intensity. These blooms, like those of the Ordovician, consumed oxygen as they died and decomposed, creating anoxic dead zones that spread across the seafloor, suffocating bottom-dwelling communities, forcing mobile species into ever-shrinking refuges of oxygenated water. The Devonian extinction, sometimes called the Late Devonian Crisis, unfolded over several million years, not a single catastrophic event, but a series of pulses, each one eliminating another fraction of marine biodiversity, each one pushing ecosystems closer to collapse. The placoderms, those armored fish that had dominated for so long, disappeared entirely, their kind never to return. The reef-building organisms, stromatoporoids and tabulate corals, suffered catastrophic losses. The great reef systems that had stretched for thousands of miles reduced to isolated patches, ghosts of their former extent. trilobites, already diminished from the Ordovician event, took another devastating blow, their diversity dropping to levels from which they would never fully recover, marking the beginning of their long decline toward final extinction. And yet, as always, some groups thrived in the chaos. The ammonites, relatives of the nautiloids, proliferated in the aftermath, their coiled shells becoming one of the most successful designs in marine history, persisting through multiple extinction events, adapting to nearly every marine environment until their own eventual end millions of years later. The sharks survived, their adaptable body plan proving resilient, and the early bony fish, ancestors of most modern fish, diversified rapidly, filling niches left vacant by the placoderms, beginning lineages that would eventually colonize every ocean, every lake, every stream. On land, the tetrapods, those pioneering vertebrates, continued their gradual mastery of terrestrial life, developing stronger limbs, more efficient lungs, skin that could resist desiccation, and in the coal swamps of the Carboniferous period that followed, they would flourish, giving rise to the first amphibians, and eventually to the amniotes, creatures whose eggs could survive away from water, opening entire continents to colonization. The Carboniferous world was one of extremes. Vast swamp forests covering much of the tropical regions, trees growing to staggering heights, some more than 100 feet tall, their root systems stabilizing sediments, their biomass accumulating in thick layers that would, over millions of years, compress into the coal seams that would one day power human industry. Oxygen levels soared, reaching concentrations perhaps as high as 35%, compared to 21% today. And in this oxygen-rich atmosphere, arthropods grew to proportions that seem fantastical. Dragonflies with wingspans of more than 2 feet, millipedes stretching 6 feet in length, creatures that could only exist in such unusual atmospheric conditions. But this abundance, this excess, was setting the stage for another collapse, another moment when the Earth would simplify itself through catastrophe, preparing for the greatest extinction of all. The Permian period stretched across 50 million years, from 299 million years ago to 252 million years ago. And during this vast span, the world assembled itself into a configuration it had never known before and would never know again. All the major land masses converged, grinding together along collision zones that thrust up mountain ranges of Himalayan scale, until there was only one continent, Pangaea, a supercontinent stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single great ocean called Panthalassa. The interior of this enormous landmass was desert, thousands of miles from any coast, rain shadows cast by the peripheral mountains, ensuring that moisture never penetrated far inland, creating conditions of extreme aridity, temperatures that swung wildly between day and night, summer and winter, a continental climate more severe than anything we experience today. But along the coasts, in the remaining shallow seas, life had achieved a complexity and diversity that rivaled anything that came before. Coral reefs built by rugose and tabulate corals, forests of crinoids, those flower-like echinoderms anchored to the seafloor, their arms filtering the water for plankton, creating submarine gardens of extraordinary beauty. On land, the synapsids had risen to dominance, those mammal-like reptiles that were neither fully reptilian nor fully mammalian, but something in between, creatures like Dimetrodon, with its great sail, likely used for temperature regulation, or the dicynodonts, herbivores with beaked mouths and sometimes tusks, filling the niches that would later belong to mammals. The forests had changed too. The great coal swamps of the Carboniferous had dried as the climate shifted, replaced by seed ferns and early conifers, plants that could tolerate drier conditions, that didn't require standing water to reproduce. And among these new forests moved insects and early reptiles, predators and prey in an ecosystem that was beginning to resemble, in its basic structure, what would come much later. Everything seemed stable, successful, as though life had found a sustainable equilibrium. But deep beneath the surface, in what is now Siberia, something was building. Magma had been rising for perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, pooling in vast chambers beneath the continental crust, finding weaknesses, exploiting fissures, and around 252 million years ago, it broke through. The Siberian Traps eruption began, not as a single volcanic mountain, but as a flood basalt event, lava welling up through countless fissures, spreading across the landscape in flows that extended for hundreds of miles, layer upon layer building up, eventually covering an area comparable to the continental United States, in some places more than 2 miles thick. The volume of lava was almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest somewhere around 1 million cubic miles of molten rock, released over a period of perhaps 1 million years, though most of it erupted in intense pulses lasting tens of thousands of years, brief by geological standards, catastrophic by any other measure. But the lava itself, though devastating to anything in its immediate path, was not the primary killer. As the magma rose, it passed through layers of sedimentary rock, coal beds and limestone and evaporates, and the heat caused chemical reactions. Combustion of coal releasing carbon dioxide, heating of limestone releasing more carbon dioxide, vaporization of salt deposits releasing chlorine and other halogens, all pouring into the atmosphere in quantities that dwarfed anything from modern industry. Carbon dioxide levels soared, the greenhouse effect intensified, global temperatures rose and rose, perhaps by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, turning an already warm world into something approaching a planetary fever. The oceans began to warm, surface temperatures in some regions reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius, hot enough to threaten the survival of most marine life, hot enough to shut down the thermohaline circulation, that global conveyor belt of ocean currents driven by differences in temperature and salinity. Without this circulation, the deep ocean lost its oxygen supply. The cold, oxygen-rich water that normally sinks at the poles and flows along the bottom ceased to form, and the deep ocean became stagnant, anoxic, a realm of sulfur-reducing bacteria producing hydrogen sulfide, poison accumulating in the depths. As the ocean warmed further, its capacity to hold dissolved oxygen decreased, the laws of chemistry dictating that warm water holds less gas than cold water, and the oxygen minimum zone, that layer of low oxygen water that exists naturally at intermediate depths, began to expand, rising toward the surface, pressing upward. Marine life found itself caught between warming surface waters that were becoming uninhabitable and rising anoxia from below, trapped in a shrinking band of survivable conditions, a vise closing from both directions, and then the hydrogen sulfide reached the surface. bubbling up from the depths, poisoning the remaining oxygenated zones, releasing into the atmosphere where it would have created a visible haze, a greenish-purple cast to the sky, the smell of decay permeating everything. On land, the greenhouse warming had equally devastating effects. The interior of Pangaea, already desert, became even more extreme. Temperatures in some regions possibly exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, beyond the thermal tolerance of most vertebrates, rendering vast areas completely uninhabitable. Acid rain fell as sulfur dioxide and other volcanic gases reacted with atmospheric moisture, corroding the forests, damaging the waxy coatings on leaves, acidifying soils and freshwater systems, killing the plants that form the base of terrestrial food webs. The ozone layer thinned as chlorine and bromine from the volcanic emissions catalyzed the destruction of ozone molecules, allowing harmful ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface at intensities that caused mutations, burned tissues, killed phytoplankton in the surface ocean, further disrupting the base of marine food chains. Wildfires swept across the dying forests, ignited by lightning or volcanic activity, spreading unchecked through vegetation stressed by heat and acid and drought. The charcoal layer preserved in the rock record speaks to conflagrations on a continental scale, entire ecosystems reduced to ash, and still the volcanism continued, pulse after pulse, each one injecting more carbon dioxide, more sulfur, more halogens, each one pushing global systems further from any stable state, creating positive feedback loops that amplified the warming, that accelerated the anoxia, that drove temperatures higher still. The extinction unfolded over perhaps 60,000 years, maybe less. Geological evidence suggests multiple pulses of extinction, waves of death separated by brief intervals where conditions stabilized, allowed a few species to recover slightly before the next pulse hit. By the time it ended, somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species had disappeared. The single worst die-off in the history of complex life, the Great Dying, the Permian Triassic extinction event that nearly ended the story before it could continue. The trilobites, those ancient arthropods that had persisted through two previous mass extinctions, finally vanished entirely, their 300 million year run coming to an end, leaving only fossils, only impressions in stone, the rugose and tabulate corals, builders of Permian reefs, went extinct, their architectural innovations lost, and with them went the countless species that depended on reef habitats, an entire ecosystem structure erased. The great forests of the Permian died back, replaced by bare ground, by landscapes dominated by a single species of fungus, Reduvia sporonites, that fed on the dead wood, that spread across continents, a fungal world, a pause in the story of forests that would last for millions of years. On land, perhaps 70% of vertebrate species disappeared. The great synapsids that had dominated for so long reduced to a handful of survivors. Most dicynodont lineages terminated. Most gorgonopsians gone. The ecological complexity built up over tens of millions of years simplified to nearly nothing. The few survivors found themselves in a world almost unrecognizable. Oceans that remained largely anoxic for millions of years. Land surfaces scarred and barren. Food webs reduced to the simplest possible structures. Primary producers barely hanging on. A few herbivores, a few predators, gaps everywhere. Recovery was slow, agonizingly slow by the standards of previous extinctions. The early Triassic period characterized by what paleontologists call the survival interval, a span of perhaps 5 million years when diversity remained stubbornly low, when ecosystems struggled to rebuild complexity, held back by lingering environmental stress, by the absence of key functional groups, by the sheer magnitude of the loss. And yet, as always, life persisted. The survivors, random in some cases, well adapted in others, simply lucky in most, began the slow work of diversification, of filling empty niches, of experimenting with new body plans, new strategies. The archosaurs, a relatively minor group during the Permian, began their rise. These reptiles, ancestors of crocodiles and dinosaurs and birds, possessed certain advantages in the hot, oxygen-depleted world of the early Triassic. More efficient respiratory systems, perhaps, better heat tolerance, whatever the reasons. They proliferated, diversified, set the stage for the age of dinosaurs that would follow. In the oceans, new kinds of coral evolved, the scleractinian corals that build modern reefs, unrelated to the extinct rugose and tabulate forms, but arriving at similar solutions to the problem of building carbonate structures, of creating habitat, of processing sunlight and nutrients into three-dimensional complexity. The ammonites, hit hard by the extinction, bounced back with extraordinary rapidity, their populations exploding, their forms diversifying into countless variations on the basic coiled shell, occupying every marine environment from shallow coastal waters to the open ocean. And in the slow, patient way of evolution, the ancestors of mammals, those few synapsid survivors, persisted, remained small, remained marginal, waiting through the age of dinosaurs for their own opportunity, their own moment of expansion into emptiness. The Triassic period unfolded slowly, hesitantly, as though the earth itself was uncertain how to proceed after such comprehensive devastation. But eventually, across 10 million years, then 20 million, ecosystems reassembled, complexity returned, and the world entered what would become the age of reptiles. Dinosaurs appeared first as modest creatures, small bipedal forms running through the undergrowth, opportunistic feeders in a world still dominated by other archosaurs, by the massive crocodile relatives that prowled both land and water, by pterosaurs that had taken to the air, filling the skies with leathery wings. The continents remained locked together in Pangaea for much of the Triassic, though stresses were building, the supercontinent beginning to fracture along what would become the Atlantic Ocean, rifts forming, pulling apart with geological slowness, creating basins that would eventually flood with seawater. And then, around 201 million years ago, another pulse of volcanism began. The Central Atlantic magmatic province erupted as Pangaea split, flood basalts pouring out along the rift zones, covering what is now parts of South America, Africa, North America, Europe, an area of more than 4 million square miles. Volume estimates suggest around 1 million cubic miles of lava, comparable to the Siberian traps. The pattern repeated. Carbon dioxide released in enormous quantities, global warming, ocean acidification, the same mechanisms that had devastated the Permian world now operating again, though on a slightly lesser scale, or perhaps the biosphere, having learned nothing, being incapable of learning, simply endured what it could not prevent. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction event eliminated roughly 70 to 75% of species, devastating but not world-ending. The largest land animals disappeared. The last of the large non-dinosaurian archosaurs went extinct. Many marine reptiles vanished, and the ammonites, those ever-resilient cephalopods, suffered yet another near-total collapse before recovering once more. But in the aftermath, the dinosaurs, previously subordinate, previously just one group among many, suddenly found the world open to them, the competition eliminated, the large-bodied niches vacant, and they radiated into this emptiness with extraordinary speed. Within 10 million years of the extinction, dinosaurs had diversified into the major groups that would dominate for the next 135 million years. The long-necked sauropods that would eventually include the largest land animals ever to exist, the armored and plated forms, the bipedal carnivores that would culminate in Tyrannosaurus, the countless herbivorous species that formed the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems. The Jurassic world was lush, warm, humid across much of the planet, with shallow seas flooding the continental margins, creating vast marine environments rich in plankton, in ammonites and belemnites, in marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that had returned to the ocean, re-evolving fins and streamlined bodies, solving again the problems their distant ancestors had solved hundreds of millions of years earlier. On land, the forests transformed, cycads and ginkgos and conifers creating canopies beneath which dinosaurs browsed, their necks reaching heights that would have seemed impossible, their bodies processing vegetation in gut chambers that fermented plant material, releasing methane, contributing their own small share to atmospheric greenhouse gases. And among the trees, small forms scurried, the early mammals, descended from those few Permian synapsid survivors, remaining small, remaining nocturnal mostly, adapted to life in the shadows of giants, developing fur and warm-bloodedness, nursing their young, innovations that would matter greatly later, but counted for little in an age dominated by reptiles. The Cretaceous period followed, beginning 145 million years ago, and it saw perhaps the peak of dinosaur diversity. The continents now separated, each one developing its own unique assemblages of species, island biogeography operating on a continental scale. Flowering plants appeared, angiosperms, with their revolutionary approach to reproduction, partnering with insects for pollination, producing fruits to entice animals into seed dispersal, and these plants, so recently arrived, spread rapidly, diversifying into thousands of species, transforming landscapes, creating new resources, new niches, new opportunities for specialization. The herbivorous dinosaurs adapted to these new plants, developing complex teeth for processing them, elaborate chewing mechanisms, and the carnivores that hunted them grew more sophisticated, some developing enhanced vision, others pack-hunting behaviors, the evolutionary arms race intensifying, producing ever more refined predators and ever more defended prey. In the oceans, the ammonites reached their zenith of diversity. Thousands of species with shells ranging from tiny spirals smaller than a coin to massive forms several feet across. They occupied every marine environment, served as prey for countless predators and their shells, sinking to the seafloor after death, accumulated in such numbers that entire rock formations consist primarily of their remains. Marine reptiles had diversified too. Mosasaurs, relatives of modern monitor lizards, had returned to the sea and grown to lengths approaching 50 feet. Apex predators with powerful jaws and streamlined bodies, dominating the warm, shallow seas that covered much of the continental interiors. Everything seemed sustainable, a stable world that might persist indefinitely. Diversity at levels that rivaled the modern. Ecological complexity fully recovered from the Triassic-Jurassic event, the scars healed, the systems resilient, and then, 66 million years ago, something fell from the sky. The asteroid was perhaps 6 to 9 miles in diameter, traveling at roughly 45,000 miles per hour when it struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released energy equivalent to perhaps 10 billion Hiroshima bombs, a number so large it loses meaning. The crater it created, Chicxulub, measured roughly 112 miles across. The impact vaporized the asteroid itself, vaporized the rock it struck, sent molten material spraying upward and outward, some of it reaching escape velocity, leaving Earth entirely, most of it arcing up into the atmosphere before falling back as a global layer of heated debris. The immediate effects were apocalyptic. Everything within hundreds of miles simply ceased to exist, vaporized or incinerated or crushed by the shock wave. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high radiated outward from the impact site, sweeping across coastlines, flooding continental interiors, carrying marine sediments miles inland. The ejected material, billions of tons of pulverized rock, spread through the upper atmosphere, particles small enough to remain suspended, blocking sunlight, creating a global twilight that lasted for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis shutting down, temperatures plummeting as the sunlight that had warmed the surface could no longer penetrate. Wildfires ignited across the planet as heated ejecta rained down, setting forests ablaze, the soot and ash adding to the atmospheric burden, further reducing light levels, the world going dark and cold simultaneously, a nuclear winter without the war. The food chains collapsed from the bottom up. Phytoplankton died in the darkness. The zooplankton that fed on them starved. The small fish that ate the zooplankton followed, and up the chain the extinction propagated, reaching eventually the largest predators, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, the great marine reptiles that had no capacity to endure prolonged starvation. On land, the plants died, not all of them, but most, especially the large trees that required continuous photosynthesis, their leaves falling, their growth ceasing, and the herbivores that depended on them, the great sauropods and ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, found themselves in a world suddenly devoid of food. The carnivores followed shortly after, as their prey populations collapsed. The large tyrannosaurs and abelisaurs, the top predators with high caloric needs, lasted only as long as carrion remained. Then they too succumbed, their bodies joining the mass grave that the late Cretaceous had become. The extinction was swift and brutal. Approximately 75% of all species disappeared, including all non-avian dinosaurs, all pterosaurs, all ammonites, most marine reptiles, and countless other lineages large and small. But the pattern, familiar now, played out again. Some survived. Small mammals that could shelter underground, that could subsist on seeds and insects, birds, direct descendants of theropod dinosaurs, whose ability to fly allowed them to range widely in search of food. Some reptiles, crocodilians, and turtles, whose slow metabolisms allowed them to endure prolonged periods without eating. The Paleocene epoch dawned on a devastated world, but one already beginning to recover. Ferns spread rapidly across the bare ground, their spores having survived in the soil, creating a fern spike visible in the fossil record, a brief interval when ferns dominated before being replaced by the returning trees, and the mammals, released from more than 100 million years of subordination, began their radiation into the emptiness, growing larger, diversifying rapidly, filling niches that had belonged to dinosaurs, herbivores and carnivores, browsers and grazers, predators ranging from cat-sized to eventually larger than any land predator before them. Within 10 million years, the world was unrecognizable, mammals dominating the land, birds filling the skies, the age of reptiles truly over, replaced by the age of mammals and birds, the descendants of the survivors, ordinary creatures that happen to possess, through no virtue of their own, the characteristics necessary to endure catastrophe. And still the story was not complete. Extinction had not finished its work. One more event remained, smaller than the others, more recent, but no less instructive. The Quaternary period began only 2.6 million years ago, practically yesterday in the language of deep time, and it brought with it a rhythm of glaciation, ice ages pulsing across the northern continents, advancing and retreating in cycles tied to subtle variations in Earth's orbit, the slow wobble and tilt that altered how sunlight distributed itself across the seasons. During the glacial maxima, ice sheets covered much of North America and Europe and Asia, miles thick in places, grinding down mountains, carving valleys, locking up so much water that sea levels dropped by more than 300 feet, exposing land bridges that had been submerged for millions of years. And across these land bridges, during the warmer interglacial periods, life migrated, species mixing that had been separated by ocean, populations expanding and contracting with the ice, adapting to the cycling climate or going extinct when they could not. The megafauna flourished, enormous mammals that seem almost fantastical now, mammoths and mastodons with their great curved tusks, giant ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats with canines designed for a killing bite that no modern predator can match, glyptodons like armored vehicles, enormous shelled creatures that grazed the grasslands of South America. In Australia, even stranger forms evolved in isolation, marsupial lions, giant wombats, massive flightless birds, the continent having separated so long ago that its mammals took entirely different paths, filling niches with different body plans, different solutions to the same problems. But around 50,000 years ago, something new appeared, a species that had evolved in Africa, that had developed tools and fire and language, that could plan and communicate and cooperate in ways no previous animal had managed. Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa, moving into Europe and Asia, crossing into Australia perhaps 65,000 years ago, reaching the Americas somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, though the exact timing remains debated. And wherever this species arrived, the megafauna began to disappear. The correlation is striking. Mammoths survived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, endured multiple glacial cycles, but within a few thousand years of human arrival in specific regions, they vanished. The last mammoths dying on Wrangel Island only 4,000 years ago, isolated, cut off from the mainland by rising seas, persisting until human sailors finally reached them. In Australia, the megafauna disappeared rapidly after human arrival. Giant kangaroos and massive echidnas and predatory monitor lizards that weighed half a ton, all gone within a few millennia, the extinction coinciding too precisely with human colonization to be merely coincidence. The Americas saw perhaps the most dramatic losses: horses and camels, both native to North America, both disappearing around 11,000 to 13,000 years ago, along with giant beavers and dire wolves and American lions and cheetahs and short-faced bears and Colombian mammoths and ground sloths and glyptodons. More than 70% of large mammal genera gone. The debate continues about how much was human hunting. How much was climate change at the end of the last ice age? How much was disease or habitat alteration or some combination of all factors? But the pattern holds across continents, across islands. Megafauna extinction following human arrival with remarkable consistency. And this event, the quaternary extinction, though smaller in absolute numbers than the Big Five, represents something qualitatively different. The first time, perhaps the only time, that extinction was driven primarily by biology rather than geology, by the actions of a single species rather than volcanism or impact or climate shifts beyond any organism's control. It marks the beginning of what some call the sixth extinction, the ongoing event, the current crisis, where species disappears at rates that rival the great dyings of the past, not from asteroid impact or flood basalts, but from habitat destruction and introduced species and climate change driven by industrial activity, from causes that are, for the first time in 4 billion years, potentially preventable. The story of extinction is also the story of recovery, of resilience, of the way life finds purchase in the smallest refugia, the way diversity rebuilds from almost nothing, given time, given space, given the absence of ongoing catastrophe. After the Ordovician-Silurian event, recovery took perhaps 5 million years, the oceans slowly repopulating, complexity returning, though the specific forms were different, the ecological roles filled by new actors. After the Permian Triassic, recovery was slower, 10 million years at least, before diversity approached pre-extinction levels, the delay perhaps caused by lingering ocean anoxia, by climatic instability, by the sheer magnitude of the loss, making it difficult for ecosystems to reassemble their component parts, but always, eventually, life returned, diversified, filled the empty spaces, and in doing so, often explored entirely new possibilities, innovations that might never have evolved if the previous occupants hadn't been cleared away. The mammals, for instance, likely would never have radiated as they did if the dinosaurs had persisted. The ecological space simply wasn't available. And without that radiation, without the specific pathway that led to primates and eventually to humans, the world would be unrecognizably different. No language, no technology, no consciousness contemplating its own origins. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, flourished after the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. Their partnership with insect pollinators, giving them advantages in the recovering ecosystems, and their success created resources that enabled further mammalian diversification, fruits and nuts and grasses supporting new dietary specialists, herbivores that could process these new foods, predators that could hunt these new herbivores. Each extinction, each recovery changed not just which species existed, but the fundamental rules of how ecosystems operated, the nutrient cycles, the energy flows, the patterns of predation and competition and cooperation. Nothing ever returned exactly to what it had been, the arrow of time pointing always forward into novelty, into unrepeatable configurations. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that stability is temporary, that what seems permanent is merely slow to change, that the earth contains within itself, in its molten interior, in the vacuum of space that surrounds it, in the chemistry of its atmosphere and oceans, the capacity for transformation that respects no lineage, no success, no adaptation. The trilobites persisted for 300 million years, longer than any other complex animal group, survivors of catastrophe after catastrophe, and yet they too ended, their last species disappearing in the Permian, leaving only fossils to mark their passage. The ammonites lasted nearly 400 million years, surviving 4 mass extinctions, bouncing back each time, radiating into new forms, and yet they could not survive the 5th, could not endure the aftermath of the asteroid, their kind never to swim the seas again. What determines survival seems almost arbitrary, not strength, not complexity, not even adaptability in any simple sense, but rather the possession of specific traits that happen to matter in one particular catastrophe, traits that offer no advantage in normal times, that might even be disadvantageous, but that make the difference when the world breaks. Small body size, low metabolic rate, ability to shelter underground or underwater, dietary flexibility, wide geographic range. These factors appear again and again in survivor species, but they guarantee nothing. Many species with all these advantages still perished, while others lacking them somehow endured. Luck, in other words, plays an enormous role, being in the right place when disaster strikes, having by chance the physiology that tolerates the new conditions, randomness braided through the pattern, making prediction impossible, making every survival a minor miracle. The Earth has hosted life for roughly 3.5 billion years, complex multicellular life for perhaps 600 million, and in that time, countless species have appeared, thrived, and vanished, their tenure on the planet ranging from a few million years to hundreds of millions. The average species duration, for those we can measure in the fossil record, appears to be somewhere between 1 and 10 million years, with enormous variation, some disappearing almost as soon as they arise, others persisting virtually unchanged for vast spans. Horseshoe crabs and coelacanths and crocodilians, lineages that found stable solutions and kept them, lucky enough to avoid extinction, adapted enough to endure the changes that did occur. Against this backdrop, humanity's tenure is vanishingly brief, anatomically modern humans existing for perhaps 300,000 years, civilization for only 10,000, industrialization for only 3 centuries, a blink, a fraction of a percent, so new that we have barely begun our story, and yet in this brief moment we have become a geological force, our actions altering atmospheric chemistry, ocean pH, global temperature, species distributions, sediment patterns, creating a signature that will persist in the rock record, marking this time as distinct, as a boundary, as a moment when something changed. Whether that boundary becomes an extinction event on the scale of the Permian or the Cretaceous, or merely a minor disruption, a small correction, depends on choices being made now, in this brief window before momentum carries systems past points of recovery. The Earth will endure regardless. Life will persist. Evolution will continue, producing new forms to fill whatever niches remain, whatever conditions prevail. The planet is patient. The time scales are vast, and if humanity removes itself through its own actions, or is removed by consequences it set in motion, the world will simply note our passing, add our fossils to the layers, and continue. But there is something worth preserving here, something rare perhaps in the universe, consciousness that can contemplate its origins, that can trace the lineage back through mammals and reptiles and fish, and earlier still to the first cells, that can read the story written in stone and understand what it means, both for what has been and what might yet be. The night deepens, the stars turn in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in sediments accumulating now, the record of our moment is being written, grain by grain, shell by shell, a story that will remain long after we cannot read it, testament to a species that learned to ask questions about time and existence and meaning, and sometimes, briefly, managed to find answers. The extinction events teach us that nothing is permanent, that success offers no protection, that the earth recycles everything, given enough time, returning even mountains to the sea, even continents to the mantle, and yet within this impermanence there is continuity, the unbroken thread of life stretching back to the beginning, surviving every catastrophe, every trial, emerging different but persisting always, adapting, recovering, beginning again. And in that persistence, that refusal to end, there is something like hope, not certainty, not promise, but possibility. The chance that even after the worst, even after loss, that seems total, life finds a way, explores new forms, discovers new solutions, and the story continues into a future we cannot see, toward outcomes we cannot predict, but which will unfold, regardless of our presence, in the slow, patient way of deep time, where even extinction is not ending, but transformation, not death, but change, the price and the mechanism of everything that lives. The words drift now, like sediment settling, like ash from ancient eruptions, layer upon layer, building the record, marking the time, and in the settling, in the quiet accumulation, there is peace, the peace of understanding that we are part of something larger, something that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we depart, something that cannot be destroyed, only changed, endlessly, beautifully, mysteriously changed.